Some men are born dangerous. Others are forged that way by blood and regret. Caleb Rourke was both, a man whose fists had ended a life, whose rage had carved scars deeper than any blade. He'd chosen the wilderness because it asked nothing of him, judged nothing, remembered nothing. Then came the storm, and with it, a woman who laughed at lightning while her world burned around her. One choice, one night, one stranger who would shatter every wall he'd spent a decade building. This is the story of a man who learned that survival isn't living, and that the greatest danger isn't losing control, but never risking it at all. If you want to see how far this story travels, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The canyon trail turned treacherous after dark. Caleb Rourke knew this stretch of high country like he knew the calluses on his own hands. Every switchback, every loose stone, every place where the path narrowed to nothing but faith and foolishness. The storm had come in fast from the northwest, turning the October sky black as pitch and splitting it open with lightning that made the rocks glow white. Rain hammered down in sheets so thick he could barely see his horse's ears. He should have made camp an hour ago, should have stopped when the first drops started falling. But Caleb had never been good at should have, and tonight the restlessness that lived in his chest had driven him forward when sense told him to wait. Now he was paying for it. Thunder rolled through the canyon like artillery fire, echoing off stone walls that rose 300 feet on either side. His horse, a rangy buckskin gelding named Flint, picked his way along the trail with the careful precision of an animal that understood consequences. Water poured off the brim of Caleb's hat, soaking through his coat, his shirt, running cold down his spine. He was a big man, 6'3" in his stockings, broad through the shoulders, with hands that could gentle a wild Mustang or break a man's jaw with equal ease. His face was hard-planed and weathered, all sharp angles and old scars, with eyes the color of winter slate. He wore his dark hair longer than was fashionable, tied back with a strip of leather, and a week's worth of beard shadowed his jaw. He was 32 years old, and he looked like a man who'd lived twice that. The trail curved sharply ahead, hugging the canyon wall. Caleb leaned back in the saddle, giving Flint his head as the horse navigated the turn. They were halfway through when the lightning struck, a brilliant, deafening bolt that hit the rim above them, splitting a pine tree with a crack like a rifle shot. Flint spooked sideways, hooves skidding on wet stone. For one heart-stopping moment, they teetered on the edge of nothing, the darkness opening up beneath them like a mouth. Caleb's thighs clamped tight, and he shifted his weight hard to the inside, dragging the horse's head around, murmuring low and steady even as his pulse hammered in his throat. "Easy, easy now. You're all right. We're all right." The horse steadied, sides heaving, and Caleb let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. His hands were rock-steady on the reins. They always were in a crisis. But his heart was pounding hard enough to hurt. That had been close. Too damn close. He should turn back, find an overhang, make a cold camp, wait out the storm. But turning back meant retracing half a mile of narrow trail in pitch darkness, and forward meant another mile to where the canyon widened into a basin with shelter and flat ground. Forward it was. They moved on, more carefully now, Flint's ears swiveling constantly. The rain intensified, coming down so hard it stung the exposed skin of Caleb's face. Water ran in torrents down the canyon walls, carving new channels in the earth, turning the trail into a river of mud and stones. Then, through the roar of the storm, Caleb heard something that made him pull up short. Voices. No, not voices. A voice. Singular, human. And it was laughing. Caleb sat perfectly still in the saddle, rain drumming on his shoulders, listening. The sound came again. Bright, clear, unmistakable. A woman's laughter, high and wild and completely inappropriate for the circumstances. What the hell? He urged Flint forward, rounding another bend, and there, illuminated by a flash of lightning that turned the world momentarily white, he saw it. A wagon. Overturned. One wheel shattered, the rest bent at impossible angles. Supplies scattered across the trail, crates, barrels, bundles of canvas. And standing beside the wreckage, soaked to the skin, her arms spread wide to the storm, was a woman. She was spinning, actually spinning in circles in the rain, her head thrown back, her laughter bright as bells against the thunder. Caleb stared. He'd seen a lot of strange things in his years in the high country. Prospectors driven mad by isolation, drifters who talked to rocks, settlers who tried to farm land that would never give them anything but heartbreak. But he'd never seen anyone stand in the middle of a disaster and laugh like they'd just been handed a gift. Lightning flashed again, and in that instant of brilliance he saw her clearly. A woman in her mid-20s, tall and lean, wearing a dress that might have been blue or gray before the rain turned it black. Her hair, loose and wild, whipped around her face like dark silk. She wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. Her features were too strong for that, her jaw too stubborn, her mouth too wide. But there was something arresting about her, something that made it impossible to look away. She spun again, stumbled, and laughed harder. Caleb nudged Flint forward into the circle of debris. The woman didn't notice him at first. She was too busy dancing with the storm. But when Flint's hoof struck a rock, she whirled around, and for the first time Caleb saw her eyes. They were extraordinary. Dark as the storm itself, bright with something that might have been madness or might have been pure, undiluted joy. "Well," she said, and her voice was breathless and delighted, "look what the storm dragged in. A ghost rider on a phantom horse. Have you come to take me to the afterlife, or are you real?" Caleb's jaw tightened. Up close he could see she was shivering, not from cold alone, but from something deeper. Shock, maybe. Or the kind of exhaustion that came from pushing too hard for too long. "I'm real enough," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't talk much, living alone, and his words came out harder than he intended. "What the hell are you doing out here?" "Dancing," she said, as if it were obvious. "The storm's magnificent, don't you think? All that rage and power makes you feel small and alive at the same time. Makes you feel dead if you stand in it long enough. Where's your people?" The light in her eyes dimmed slightly. "Gone. There was a man hired to drive the wagon, but when we started to tip, he jumped clear and ran. Can't say I blame him. Self-preservation is a powerful instinct." She gestured at the wreckage. "I tried to save it, but physics had other ideas." Caleb looked at the overturned wagon, then at the woman, then back at the wagon. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Water was already pooling around the scattered supplies, and the temperature was dropping. This high up, October nights could dip below freezing. Every instinct he had told him to ride on. This wasn't his problem. He didn't know this woman, didn't owe her anything. Getting involved with people led to complications, and complications led to pain. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, and he'd spent the last 10 years living by it. But even as he thought it, he knew he wasn't going to leave her here. "Damn it!" "Can you ride?" he asked. She blinked up at him, rain streaming down her face. "On a horse?" "No, on a lightning bolt." "Yes, on a horse." A smile curved her mouth, a real smile, not the manic grin she'd worn while dancing. "I can stay on if you can get me on." Caleb swung down from the saddle, his boots squelching in the mud. He was a head taller than her, and when he moved close, she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. This close he could see the exhaustion written in the lines around her mouth, the way her hands trembled despite her bravado. "There's a basin about a mile ahead," he said. "Shelter. We can wait out the storm there. At first light, we'll come back for what can be saved." "We?" she repeated. "You're helping me? Don't make me regret it. What's your name?" "Alara," she said. "Alara Vance. And you are?" "Rourke." "Just Rourke?" "That's all you need." He moved to Flint's side, checking the cinch, adjusting the stirrups. The horse eyed him skeptically, as if to say, "This is a terrible idea," and Caleb couldn't argue. But he was committed now. He turned to find Alara gathering items from the scattered supplies. A canvas bag, a small trunk, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Leave it," he said. "These are important. They're not more important than not dying of exposure. Leave them." She hesitated, then nodded, but not before snatching up the canvas bag and slinging it over her shoulder. Stubborn. That was going to be a problem. Caleb mounted first, then held down his arm. "Foot in the stirrup, hand on my arm. I'll pull you up." She did as instructed, and despite the cold and the rain and the general absurdity of the situation, she moved with a natural athleticism that surprised him. One smooth motion, and she was settled behind him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her body pressed against his back. He tried to ignore how warm she felt, how alive. "Hold on," he said, and urged Flint forward into the storm. The mile to the basin felt like 10. The trail was a river of mud now, treacherous and uncertain. Twice Flint nearly lost his footing. Twice Caleb's hands and voice kept them upright. Behind him, Alara held on in silence, but he could feel her shivering intensifying, feel the way her grip would occasionally loosen and then tighten again as she fought to stay conscious. By the time they reached the basin, the storm had reached a fever pitch. Wind howled through the canyon, driving the rain sideways. But here the walls curved inward, creating a natural amphitheater with an overhang deep enough to provide shelter. Caleb had camped here before, knew the small cave at the back, knew where the ground stayed dry even in heavy weather. He guided Flint under the overhang and dismounted, then reached up to help Alara down. She slid from the saddle and her legs immediately buckled. Caleb caught her, had to, or she would have hit the ground, and for a moment he held her weight against him, feeling how cold she was, how she shook like a leaf in a gale. "Easy," he said, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "You're all right. I've got you." "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was thin and her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. "Sure you are. Can you stand? Give me a moment." He gave her 10, then helped her to the cave entrance, really more of a deep recess than a proper cave, but it was dry and protected from the wind. He settled her on a flat rock, then went back for Flint, stripping off the saddle and tack with practiced efficiency, rubbing the horse down with a blanket from his pack. "You take better care of the horse than yourself," Alara observed, her voice stronger now. "Horse is smarter," Caleb said. He didn't choose to be out in this mess. That earned him a laugh, genuine and warm despite the circumstances. Working quickly, Caleb gathered dry wood from the back of the cave where it had been stacked by previous travelers. A frontier courtesy, always leaving supplies for the next person. Within minutes, he had a fire started, the flames catching hungrily, pushing back the darkness and cold. Only then did he turn his full attention to Alara. She looked half-drowned, her hair plastered to her head, her dress clinging to her frame, her lips tinged blue. But her eyes were alert, watching him with open curiosity as he moved around the small space. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes," he said, already digging in his pack for his spare shirt. "You'll catch your death otherwise." "How chivalrous." "Nothing chivalrous about it, just practical. I didn't drag you up here to have you die of pneumonia." He tossed her the shirt, heavy wool, big enough to swallow her, and a blanket. "Change. I'll turn around." He did, moving to tend to Flint, giving her privacy. Behind him, he heard the rustle of wet fabric, the small sounds of her struggling with cold, stiff fingers. He kept his eyes on the horse, on the fire, anywhere but the small shadow dance playing out on the cave wall. "You can look now," she said finally. He turned. The shirt hung nearly to her knees, the sleeves rolled up multiple times. Her hair was a wild tangle around her shoulders. She'd wrapped the blanket around herself like a cloak, and she was sitting as close to the fire as she could get without climbing into it. She looked ridiculous, and somehow still striking. Caleb poured coffee from his pack, cold from the pot he'd made that morning, but better than nothing. He heated it in a tin cup near the fire, then handed it to her. "Drink." She took it, wrapping both hands around the cup, breathing in the steam. "Thank you for all of this. You didn't have to help me." "Probably shouldn't have," Caleb said, settling on the opposite side of the fire. He poured a cup for himself, more for something to do with his hands than because he wanted it. "What were you doing out here alone?" "I wasn't supposed to be alone. I hired a driver in Redemption. Seemed trustworthy enough. But I suppose trustworthy doesn't mean brave." "Redemption's 2 days back. Where were you headed?" "Wherever the road took me." She sipped the coffee, made a face. It was strong enough to strip paint, but drank anyway. "I'm not very good at staying in one place." "That's so. What about you? Do you live out here?" "Close enough." "That's not an answer." "It's all the answer you're getting." They sat in silence for a while, the storm raging outside, the fire crackling between them. Caleb studied her covertly over the rim of his cup. She didn't act like any woman he'd known, didn't simper or flirt, didn't seem intimidated by him or the situation. She just sat there, comfortable in her own skin, watching the flames like they held answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. It made him uneasy. He didn't like unpredictable people. "Why were you laughing?" he asked finally. When? In the storm. When I found you. Your wagon was destroyed. You were alone in the middle of nowhere in a lightning storm, and you were laughing like it was the best night of your life. Alara was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Have you ever felt so trapped by circumstances that you wanted to scream? So bound by expectations and obligations that you could barely breathe? Maybe. That wagon held everything I was supposed to be, everything I was supposed to want, dresses and dishes and all the trappings of a proper life. And when it tipped over, when it all came crashing down, she smiled a strange, fierce smile. I felt free, like the universe was giving me permission to stop pretending. So yes, I laughed, because sometimes laughter is the only honest response to chaos. Caleb didn't know what to say to that. He'd spent 10 years building walls between himself and chaos, between himself and anything that might make him feel too much. The idea of embracing it, of laughing into the teeth of a storm, it was foreign to him, reckless, dangerous. You're going to get yourself killed with that attitude, he said. Maybe, but at least I'll die on my own terms. She met his eyes across the fire. What are you running from, Rourke? I'm not running. Everyone's running from something. Some people just hide it better than others. You don't know anything about me. I know you live alone in the wilderness. I know you helped a stranger when you could have ridden past. I know you're careful with your words and your horse and everything except yourself. She tilted her head, studying him. And I know you're angry. I can see it in the way you hold yourself, like you're afraid if you relax for 1 second, you'll fly apart. Caleb's jaw tightened. She was too perceptive, too willing to say things that should stay unspoken. He didn't like it, didn't like her. Except that was a lie. He did like her. That was the problem. You should get some sleep, he said, his voice flat. We'll head back at first light, see what can be salvaged. And then? And then you're not my problem anymore. If she was hurt by his bluntness, she didn't show it. She just nodded, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and lay down close to the fire. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep. Caleb stayed awake, feeding the fire, listening to the storm. Outside, the wind screamed and the rain hammered down. Inside, the woman, Alara, slept peacefully, as if she hadn't just lost everything. He didn't understand her, didn't want to understand her, but he couldn't stop watching her either. Couldn't stop noticing the way the firelight played across her face, the way she'd smiled at the storm like it was an old friend. She was trouble. He knew it like he knew his own name. And yet when morning came, when it was time to part ways and let her become someone else's problem, he had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to be that simple. Nothing ever was. Begin. By dawn, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the world scoured clean and new. The sky was that impossible blue that only came after hard rain, and the air smelled of wet stone and pine. Caleb woke stiff and sore. He dozed fitfully through the night, never quite letting himself sink into real sleep. Old habits died hard. Alara was already awake, sitting near the fire with her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls gold and rose. It's beautiful, she said without looking at him. I've never seen light like this. Caleb grunted and set about making coffee. Real coffee this time, hot and strong. He moved through the morning routine with mechanical efficiency, trying not to think about the day ahead, about what happened next. We'll go back to your wagon, he said as he handed her a cup. See what's salvageable. Then I'll take you back to Redemption. You can hire another driver. I don't want to go back to Redemption. Then wherever you were headed before. I wasn't headed anywhere specific. Caleb's patience frayed. Lady Alara. Alara, then. You can't just wander the high country alone. You'll die. If the weather doesn't kill you, the wildlife will. And if that doesn't do it, there's men out here who'll make you wish it had. Then I'll hire someone. A guide. With what money? That wagon of yours is kindling. She was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee. Then, what if I hired you? No. You haven't heard my offer. Don't need to. The answer's no. Why? Because I work alone, because I don't take passengers, because... He stopped, jaw clenched so tight it hurt. Because I can't be trusted with responsibility. Because everyone I've ever cared about has ended up hurt, or dead, or worse. Because 10 years ago I killed a man with my bare hands, and the rage that made me do it is still there. Always there, waiting. But he couldn't say any of that. So he just said, because I said no. Alara studied him with those two sharp eyes. You know what I think, Rourke? I think you're afraid. Think whatever you want. Not afraid of the wilderness, not afraid of storms or animals or hard living, afraid of people, afraid of what happens when you let someone get close. You've known me for 12 hours. You don't know a damn thing about what I'm afraid of. Maybe not, but I know what I see. She stood, set down her cup, met his eyes squarely. I see a man who's been alone so long he's forgotten how to be anything else. A man who's built a fortress around himself and called it freedom. But here's the thing about fortresses. They keep people out, but they also keep you trapped inside. Caleb felt something dangerous stir in his chest. The old anger, the old heat. She was pushing, probing, trying to get under his skin. And it was working. Finish your coffee, he said, his voice hard as stone. We're leaving. They rode back to the wagon site in tense silence. Caleb led, Alara behind him again, her arms around his waist. This time he was painfully aware of her presence, the warmth of her, the way she moved with Flint's gait, the smell of wood smoke and rain that clung to her hair. When they reached the overturned wagon, it looked worse in daylight. The wheel wasn't just broken, it was obliterated. The axle was cracked. Even if they could ride it, it would never roll again. Alara slid down from the horse and surveyed the damage with a resigned sigh. Well, that's that, I suppose. What were you carrying? Caleb asked, dismounting. Supplies, equipment, some personal things. For what? She glanced at him, hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I'm a naturalist, or trying to be anyway. I study plants, animals, geological formations. I was hoping to spend the winter documenting the high country flora and fauna. Alone. I've always worked better alone. Then we've got that in common, at least. He moved to the scattered supplies, assessing what could be salvaged. Most of the crates were intact, just muddy. The trunk had split open, spilling what looked like books and journals. He saw specimen jars, collecting equipment, sketch pads, water damaged beyond use. Can you salvage any of it? Alara asked, kneeling beside the trunk, carefully lifting out a leather-bound journal. Some. Not enough to set up a winter camp alone, if that's what you're thinking. I wasn't... She stopped, looked down at the journal in her hands. My father was a naturalist. These were his observations, his sketches, 20 years of work. There was something in her voice, grief, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Caleb looked at her more closely. In the morning light, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the hollowness in her cheeks that spoke of recent loss. He passed away, she continued, not looking up, 6 months ago. Influenza. He always said he wanted to document the northern high country, but he never got the chance, so I thought... Her voice cracked slightly. I thought I'd do it for him, finish what he started. Damn it. Caleb felt his resolve weakening, felt the walls he'd built starting to crack. This wasn't just some flighty woman on a lark. This was grief. This was purpose. This was someone trying to make meaning out of loss. He understood that. Too well. Pack what you can carry, he said abruptly. The journals, the equipment that's still intact, we'll take it back to my place. Your place? I've got a cabin about 5 miles north. You can stay there. Few days, maybe a week. Sort out your supplies, figure out your next move. I thought you didn't take passengers. I don't. This is temporary, and you stay out of my way. A slow smile curved her mouth. Is this you being kind, Rourke? This is me being practical. You die out here. I'm the last person who saw you alive. That's complications I don't need. Whatever you need to tell yourself. They worked in silence after that, sorting through the debris, packing what could be saved into makeshift bundles that could be carried on Flint. It took most of the morning. By the time they finished, the sun was high and hot, burning off the last of the night's rain. Caleb lashed the supplies to his saddle, redistributing weight carefully. It would be a slow trip with 2 riders and all this extra cargo, but Flint was strong and steady. They'd manage. Ready? He asked. Alara took one last look at the overturned wagon, the wreckage of whatever life she'd been leaving behind. Then she nodded. Ready. They rode north, following game trails and old logging roads that only someone who knew the country intimately could navigate. The high country in late October was a study in contrasts. Golden aspen groves burning bright against dark pine, meadows still green despite the advancing season, snow-capped peaks visible in the distance. Alara was quiet for the first hour, then slowly began asking questions. What kind of pine was that? Were those elk tracks? What caused the rock formations along that ridge? At first Caleb answered in monosyllables, irritated by the intrusion on his usual solitary rides, but gradually, almost against his will, his answers lengthened. He knew this country, had spent 10 years learning its secrets, and there was something satisfying about sharing that knowledge with someone who genuinely cared, who listened like every word mattered. "You missed your calling," Alara said as they stopped to water flint at a clear stream. "You should have been a teacher." "No, I shouldn't have." "Why not? You know more about this land than anyone I've met. Knowledge isn't the same as temperament." "What's wrong with your temperament?" "Everything. I don't play well with others." "I've noticed, but that's a choice, not a flaw." "You don't know anything about my choices." "Then tell me." "No." She sighed, but didn't push. They remounted and continued on. By mid-afternoon, they crested a ridge and Caleb pointed down into a small valley. There. His cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by pine and aspen, backed up against a rocky outcrop. It was small, maybe 20 feet by 15, but solidly built from hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. A corral and small barn stood off to one side. A creek ran clear and cold nearby. It looked like what it was, a place built for one person to survive alone. "It's perfect," Alara said softly. Caleb felt an unexpected flush of something that might have been pride. He pushed it down. "It's functional." They rode down into the valley. As they approached, a shape separated from the shadows of the porch, lean and gray, with eyes that caught the light like coins. Caleb felt Alara stiffen behind him. "Is that Wolf?" Caleb confirmed. "Half-wolf, anyway. His name's Ghost. He won't hurt you." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Ghost came forward as they dismounted, moving with that characteristic wolf lope, all fluid grace and latent power. He went straight to Caleb, pressing his head against his leg in greeting, then turned amber eyes on Alara. She stood very still as Ghost approached her, sniffing carefully, assessing. Then, apparently satisfied, he sat and offered a paw. Alara laughed, that same bright, unexpected sound from the night before, and shook the offered paw gravely. "Pleased to meet you, Ghost." The wolf's tail wagged once, then he trotted off toward the barn. "You live alone with a wolf," Alara said. "Of course you do. Half-wolf, and he's better company than most people." "I don't doubt it." Caleb showed her inside. The cabin was sparse, a rope bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, shelves holding supplies, a stone fireplace that served for both heat and cooking. Everything was meticulously organized, almost aggressively clean, the home of a man who needed control over his environment because he couldn't always control himself. "You can have the bed," Caleb said, already moving to gather blankets. "I'll sleep on the porch." "Don't be ridiculous. It's your home. I can sleep by the fire." "The bed." She opened her mouth to argue, caught the look on his face, and wisely closed it again. "Thank you." He nodded and escaped outside, suddenly desperate for space, for air, for the familiar solitude he'd chosen. This was a mistake. He shouldn't have brought her here, his refuge, his sanctuary, and now there was someone else in it, making it feel smaller, making him feel exposed. He busied himself with Flint, with Ghost, with a dozen small tasks that needed doing. Anything to avoid going back inside, where Alara was spreading her father's journals on the table, where she was making tea like she belonged there, where she was humming softly to herself. When he finally forced himself inside as the sun touched the western peaks, he found her at the table, bent over a journal, making notes in careful script. She looked up and smiled. "I found some of your survey maps. They're remarkable. You've mapped nearly the entire valley system." "Winter project." "Do you know what this means? These maps, combined with my father's observations, we could create a comprehensive record of the entire region. Flora, fauna, geology, weather patterns. It would be invaluable. We aren't doing anything. You're leaving in a few days. The smile faded. Right, of course. Caleb felt like an ass. He made dinner, venison stew, biscuits, coffee, and they ate in tense silence. Afterward, Alara helped clean up, then retreated to the corner with her father's journals. Caleb sat by the fire, pretending to work on a bridle that didn't need repair, hyper-aware of her presence. The way she turned pages, the way she would pause occasionally, touching the margin where her father's hand had written notes, the way grief moved across her face like shadows. "Why are you really here?" he asked finally. She looked up, surprised. "I told you, my father's work." "No, the real reason. There's dozens of naturalists who could have finished his work. Why you? Why now?" Alara was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "There was a man, Richard. I was engaged to him." "Of course there was. What happened?" "I realized I would have been miserable. He's not a bad person, quite the opposite. Successful, respected, everything a woman is supposed to want. But I didn't love him. And more than that, the life he offered, society parties and calling cards and endless, suffocating propriety, it would have killed me. Slowly maybe, but killed me all the same." "So you ran." "So I chose something else. There's a difference." She met his eyes. "I'm not running from my life, Rourke. I'm running toward something real, toward purpose, toward work that matters. By wandering the wilderness alone. I wasn't supposed to be alone. I had plans, resources. It's not my fault the wagon wrecked. It's not about fault. It's about being realistic. This country doesn't care about your plans or your purpose. It'll kill you without meaning to. Then I'll die doing something that matters instead of suffocating in a drawing room." They glared at each other across the small room. Caleb felt that dangerous heat building in his chest again, frustration, anger, and underneath it something else he didn't want to name. "You think it's brave," he said, his voice low and hard. "This thing you're doing, running off alone, rejecting safety, chasing some romantic notion of freedom and purpose. But it's not brave. It's selfish. Because when you die out here, and you will, there will be people who grieve you, people who wonder what happened, people who blame themselves for not stopping you. Like you're blaming yourself for something." The words hit like a fist. Caleb stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "I'm going to check the horses." "Rourke," but he was already out the door, into the night, where the cold air and the darkness could contain the fury rising in his throat. She was wrong. She didn't know anything about him, didn't know about the man he'd killed, about the rage that had driven his fists long past the point of self-defense. Didn't know about the trial, the verdict, manslaughter instead of murder, because the other man had started it, because witnesses said Caleb had been provoked. Didn't know about the 10 years he'd spent in this valley, alone, learning to control himself, learning to live with what he'd done. She didn't know, and she had no right to dig into wounds that had barely scarred over. But even as he thought it, standing in the dark with his hands clenched and his breathing ragged, he knew she was right. He was blaming himself, had been blaming himself for a decade, and the worst part was he couldn't tell if he deserved the blame or if he'd punished himself enough or if there was ever any such thing as enough. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Alara stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That was cruel. I had no right." "You didn't say anything that wasn't true. True doesn't mean it needed saying." They stood there in the darkness, the night vast and quiet around them. Finally, Caleb spoke, the words dragged up from somewhere deep. "I killed a man. 10 years ago. Beat him to death with my bare hands." He heard her sharp intake of breath but didn't look at her. Couldn't. He'd been causing trouble in town, drunk, aggressive, picking fights. Someone needed to stop him, and I did. Except I didn't just stop him. I kept hitting him. Even after he went down, even after he stopped moving, I couldn't. His voice cracked. I couldn't stop. By the time they pulled me off, he was dead. Rourke, the law called it manslaughter, self-defense technically, since he threw the first punch. But I knew what it was. I knew the moment my vision went red, the moment my fists kept swinging past reason, past defense, past anything human. I knew I was capable of that kind of violence, that kind of rage. So you came here. So I came here, where I couldn't hurt anyone, where I could learn to control it, or at least contain it. Alara moved closer until she was standing beside him at the porch rail. And have you learned to control it? Most days, but not all days. No, not all days. She was quiet, and in that quiet, Caleb waited for the judgment, the fear, the inevitable moment when she'd realize what he was and back away. Instead, she said, "Thank you for telling me. I know it wasn't easy. I didn't tell you so you'd feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for you, I mean." She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight her eyes were very dark and very clear. "I think you've punished yourself more than enough, and I think the fact that you worry about your temper, that you isolate yourself to protect others, that tells me you're not the monster you think you are. You don't know that. Maybe not, but I know you saved me instead of riding past. I know you're gentle with your animals. I know you've spent 10 years trying to be better. That has to count for something." Caleb shook his head. "You're too trusting. And you're not trusting enough. But maybe between the two of us, we'll find a balance." "There is no us. You're leaving in a few days, remember? Am I?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "Yes," Caleb said firmly. "You are." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. And from the small smile on Alara's face, neither was she. The few days Caleb had promised stretched into a week, then 2. October bled into November, and still Alara remained. Not that she was idle. From sunrise to sunset, she worked with a focused intensity that reminded Caleb uncomfortably of himself. She cataloged her father's journals, cross-referenced them with Caleb's maps, ventured into the surrounding woods to collect specimens and make observations. She moved through his space like water finding its course, not invasive exactly, but impossible to ignore. And slowly, against every instinct he possessed, Caleb found himself adapting to her presence. It started small. The second morning, he found coffee already made when he came in from feeding the horses. The third evening, she cooked dinner without asking, rabbit stew that was surprisingly good. By the end of the first week, they'd fallen into a rhythm that felt dangerously close to comfortable. They didn't talk much. Caleb still wasn't good at words, and Alara seemed to understand that his silence wasn't rejection, just habit. But occasionally, over dinner or while working on separate tasks in the cabin's single room, conversation would spark. "Tell me about Ghost," she said one night, watching the half-wolf doze by the fire. "How did you end up with him?" Caleb looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "Found him 3 winters back. His mother had been killed by trappers. He was maybe 8 weeks old, half-starved, too young to survive alone. Figured I'd raise him enough to release him, but..." He shrugged. "He never left." "Like recognizes like," Alara said softly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Two wild things who chose each other, or maybe needed each other." Caleb grunted and went back to his knife, but he felt the truth of her words settle somewhere under his ribs. Another evening, she asked about the books on his shelf, a surprising collection for a man who lived alone. Shakespeare, Marcus Aurelius, a battered copy of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. "My mother's," he said shortly. "She was educated, believed in the civilizing power of literature." His mouth twisted. "Didn't take with me." "I don't know about that. You quote Marcus Aurelius when you're working with the horses. I've heard you." He stared at her. "I do not." "You do. The impediment to action advances action. You said it yesterday when Flint was being stubborn about the new bridle." Caleb felt heat creep up his neck. He hadn't realized he did that, hadn't thought anyone would notice or care. "Well," he said gruffly, "horse doesn't judge bad Latin." Alara smiled. That particular smile that made him feel simultaneously irritated and oddly pleased. "Neither do I." But it wasn't all easy. There were moments when the cabin felt too small, when Caleb could feel the walls closing in, when he needed to escape before the pressure in his chest turned into something uglier. Those times he'd saddle Flint and ride hard into the high country, not coming back until exhaustion had burned away the worst of the restlessness. Alara never asked where he'd been. Just had coffee waiting, or dinner, or once, a fire built high against the evening cold, and a comfortable silence that didn't demand explanation. The real problem came on a gray afternoon in mid-November. Caleb was in the corral working with a young horse he'd been gentling, a skittish paint mare with trust issues. He was making progress, had almost gotten a blanket on her back, when Alara emerged from the woods with her collecting bag. She moved too quickly. The mare spooked, reared, and lashed out with her front hooves. Pure instinct put Caleb between the horse and Alara, his hand coming down hard on the mare's neck, his voice a thunderous command. Down! The horse dropped, trembling. Alara stumbled backward, eyes wide, and Caleb stood there with his hand still raised, adrenaline burning through his veins, rage and fear mixing into something toxic. What the hell were you thinking? His voice came out harder than he intended, sharp enough to cut. You don't approach a green horse like that. You don't move fast. You don't... I'm sorry, I didn't... You could have been killed, kicked in the head, trampled. Do you have any idea... He stopped, realized his hands were shaking, realized he was yelling at someone who'd made an honest mistake, realized he was doing exactly what he'd promised himself he'd never do again. He turned away, breathing hard, forcing his hands to unclench. Just stay in the cabin. I'll finish here. Rourke, go. Please. She went. And Caleb spent the next hour with the mare, working her through the fear his outburst had created, hating himself with every gentle touch and soothing word. This was why he lived alone. This was why he couldn't be trusted around people. One moment of adrenaline and fear, and he'd nearly what? Yelled at her? That was all he'd done. No fists, no violence, just words. Harsh words, yes, but just words. Maybe that counted for something. Or maybe he was just making excuses. When he finally went inside, Alara was at the table with her journals. She looked up as he entered, and he braced himself for tears or anger or the inevitable announcement that she'd be leaving first thing in the morning. Instead, she said calmly, "You're right. I should have been more careful. I won't make that mistake again." Caleb stopped mid-step. "That's it? What else should there be?" "I yelled at you." "Yes, and you had reason to. The horse was dangerous. I was careless, and you were protecting both of us. I appreciate it, even if the delivery was rough. I lost my temper. You raised your voice. There's a difference." She set down her pen, met his eyes. "Rourke, I've seen what real rage looks like. What you did wasn't it. You were scared, and it came out sharp. That's human, not monstrous." He wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that she didn't understand, that the line between sharp words and something worse was thinner than she knew. But looking at her steady gaze, her complete lack of fear, something in him eased. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd spent so long afraid of his own capacity for violence that he'd lost perspective on what actually constituted violence. Or maybe he was dangerous and she was too naive to see it. He didn't know, couldn't know. But that night they ate dinner in comfortable silence. And when he went to sleep on the porch, he found an extra blanket waiting, her way of saying all was forgiven. It should have made things easier. Instead, it made them more complicated. Because somewhere in the daily rhythm of shared space and shared silences, Caleb had started looking forward to seeing her each morning. Started listening for her footsteps, her voice, her laughter. Started feeling something he hadn't felt in 10 years. Something warm and terrifying and utterly unwelcome. He was beginning to care. The realization hit him one evening in late November. They were sitting by the fire after dinner, Alara reading from one of her father's journals, occasionally sharing interesting passages. She'd been describing a rare orchid her father had found, her voice animated, her whole face lit with enthusiasm. And Caleb had found himself watching her instead of listening, thinking how alive she looked, how beautiful in her passion. And then she'd glanced up, caught him staring, and smiled, a warm, intimate smile that made his chest tight. And he'd felt it. The wanting, the need, the dangerous, impossible desire to reach across the space between them, and he'd stood abruptly. "I need to check the horses." "Rourke, you checked them an hour ago." "Checking again." He'd fled into the cold night air, his heart hammering. This was bad. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. Caring led to attachment. Attachment led to vulnerability, and vulnerability led to disaster. Every single time. He couldn't do this, couldn't let this happen, which meant Alara had to go. Now. Before this thing between them grew into something neither of them could ignore. He went back inside with his resolve hardened. "We need to talk." Alara looked up from her journal, immediately sensing the change in his tone. "All right. You've been here almost 3 weeks. That's long enough. Time to move on." A flicker of hurt crossed her face, quickly masked. "I see. Have I done something?" "No. But winter's coming. You need to get yourself settled somewhere with proper shelter, proper supplies. Maybe Fort Jessup. They've got a hotel, general store, people who can help you figure out your next step. Fort Jessup is 6 days' ride from here. I'll take you. We'll leave day after tomorrow." "Rourke." She stood, moved closer, and he forced himself not to back away. "What's really going on? Everything's been fine, and now suddenly, nothing's going on. I'm just being practical. This arrangement was always temporary." "Was it? Because it feels like we've been building something here. A partnership, maybe. Your maps and my father's research, your knowledge of the territory, and my scientific training. We could—" "There is no we." The words came out harsher than he intended, and he saw her flinch. "There's me, who lives alone because that's what works. And there's you, who needs to build a life that doesn't revolve around hiding in the woods." "I'm not hiding." "Aren't you? You left everything behind, family, security, a man who wanted to marry you. You're out here chasing your dead father's dreams because it's easier than facing your own life." The words hit like slaps. He watched the color drain from her face, watched her eyes go hard and bright. "That's cruel," she said quietly. "Maybe, but it's true. You don't know anything about my life or my choices. I know running when I see it. Takes one to know one." For a long moment they stared at each other across the small room, the fire crackling between them. Then Alara drew herself up, shoulders back, chin high. "Fine, we'll leave day after tomorrow. I wouldn't want to impose on your precious solitude any longer than necessary." She turned and went to the corner where she'd been sleeping. His bed, still, though he'd spent every night on the porch, and lay down with her back to him, the conversation clearly over. Caleb stood there feeling like the worst kind of bastard. He'd hurt her, deliberately, used words as weapons because he was too much of a coward to admit what he really felt. But it was better this way. Cleaner. She'd leave, eventually forget about him, and he could go back to his carefully controlled life. Alone. Safe. Empty. He went outside and didn't come back until he was sure she was asleep. The next day they barely spoke. Caleb busied himself with preparations for the journey, checking tack, packing supplies, anything to avoid the heavy silence that filled the cabin. Alara gathered her belongings with methodical efficiency, her face a careful blank. Only Ghost seemed unhappy with the arrangement, whining at the door and looking between them as if asking what had gone wrong. That night, Caleb made himself sleep inside, his last night in his own bed before 6 days on the trail. Alara had moved to the floor by the fire without comment. They ate dinner in silence, cleaned up in silence, went to their separate corners in silence. Caleb lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing, wondering how something that had felt so right had turned so wrong so quickly. Wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Wondering if it was too late to take it back. He was still awake when the storm hit. It came suddenly, the way late autumn storms did in the high country. One moment clear and cold, the next howling like something alive and angry. Wind shrieked through the valley, rattling the shutters. Rain hammered the roof, and beneath it all, a sound that made Caleb's blood run cold. A horse screaming. He was up and moving before conscious thought, grabbing his coat, running for the door. Behind him he heard Alara calling his name, but he was already outside, fighting through wind and rain toward the corral where Flint and the paint mare. The tree came down with a crack like thunder. A massive pine, old and hollow, finally giving way to the wind. It crashed across the corral fence, pinning the paint mare beneath a tangle of branches. Flint was wild-eyed, rearing and plunging against the destroyed fence. Caleb vaulted what remained of the rails. The mare was thrashing, eyes rolling white, caught under the tree's weight. If she kept fighting, she'd break a leg, and a broken leg meant a bullet. He had to calm her, had to— "Rourke!" Alara was suddenly beside him, soaked to the skin, her voice cutting through the storm. "Tell me what to do." "Get Flint out, put him in the barn, then bring the saw and rope from the workshop." She didn't argue, didn't hesitate, just moved. Caleb knelt beside the trapped mare, putting his hands on her neck, his voice low and steady despite the chaos around them. "Easy, girl. Easy now. I've got you. You're going to be fine." The horse's breathing was panicked, her heart hammering beneath his palm. But gradually, miraculously, she began to settle. Caleb kept talking, kept touching, pouring every ounce of calm he possessed into the trembling animal. Alara returned with the tools. "What now?" "We cut away what we can, then use the rope to lever the trunk up enough for her to crawl out. But we have to be fast. Once we move the tree, she's going to bolt." "What do you need me to do?" "Hold her head. Keep her calm. Can you do that?" "Yes." And she did. While Caleb sawed through branches with hands that were steady, despite the cold and the rain and the fear, Alara knelt in the mud, cradling the mare's head, murmuring words of comfort. She didn't flinch when the horse thrashed, didn't panic when lightning lit the sky white, just held on, steady as stone. Caleb had never seen anything braver. It took an hour of sawing and pulling and leveraging, of working in sync without needing words, of trusting each other completely in a moment when trust was everything. Finally, they'd cleared enough space. Caleb looped rope around the trunk, braced his feet, and pulled. "On 3, he called to Alara. "Let her go and get clear. 1, 2, 3. The mare exploded upward as the tree shifted. She scrambled free in a wild tangle of legs and terror, then stood trembling in the rain, miraculously unharmed. Caleb caught her lead line, checked her over with hands that knew every bone and tendon. No breaks, no major cuts, just fear and exhaustion. "Barn," he said shortly. "Both horses." They got the animals sheltered and fed, dried them as best they could with the supplies at hand. The mare was still shaky but responding to gentle handling. Flint was already dozing in his stall, the stoic bastard. Only then did Caleb realize he was shaking. Reaction hitting all at once, adrenaline crash mixed with relief, mixed with the overwhelming awareness of what could have happened. "Rourke," Alara's hand on his arm, warm despite the cold. "Are you all right?" "Fine." "You're not fine. You're trembling." "Just reaction. It'll pass. Come on, let's get inside." She steered him back to the cabin, sat him by the fire, put coffee in his hands. He drank without tasting it, his mind replaying the night, the tree falling, the mare trapped, the sick certainty that he was going to lose her. And through it all, Alara beside him, steady, capable, unafraid. "You were amazing out there," he said finally, his voice rough. "I did what needed doing. Most people would have panicked." "I'm not most people." She paused, then added quietly, "Neither are you." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. She was soaked and muddy, her hair a tangled mess, exhaustion written in every line of her body, and she was beautiful, not despite the disarray, but because of what it represented. Strength, courage, the willingness to stand beside him in a crisis without hesitation. "I'm sorry," he said abruptly. "What I said yesterday, about you running, about your father's dreams, it was cruel and it wasn't true." "Wasn't it?" "No, you're not running from anything. You're choosing something better. I was just—" He stopped, dragged a hand through his wet hair. "I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of this. Of you. Of what's happening between us." Alara went very still. "And what is happening between us?" Caleb set down his coffee cup, his hands unsteady. This was it. The moment. He could retreat, put the walls back up, and she'd leave tomorrow without ever knowing what he'd almost said. Or he could take the risk, be honest, choose vulnerability over safety. For the first time in 10 years, he chose vulnerability. "I care about you, Set," he said, each word feeling dragged from somewhere deep. "More than I should. More than is smart. And it scares the hell out of me because everyone I've ever cared about ends up hurt." "That's not true." "It is. My mother, she died when I was 16. Fever. I couldn't save her. The man I killed, he had a wife, children. I destroyed their lives. And after that I swore I'd never get close to anyone again. Never risk it." "Risk what?" "Caring? Risk losing control. Risk hurting someone. Risk being the cause of someone else's pain. Alara moved closer until she was kneeling in front of him, her hands covering his. Rourke, listen to me. You didn't kill your mother. Fever did, and that man you fought, you said yourself he was violent, dangerous. What happened was tragic, but it wasn't murder. It was a fight that went too far. I could have stopped. Should have stopped. But you've spent 10 years making sure it never happens again. 10 years learning control. That has to count for something. Does it? Or am I just fooling myself? What if I... His voice cracked. What if I hurt you? You won't. You can't know that. I can. Because I've seen you, Rourke. I've seen how gentle you are with the horses. With Ghost. With me. I've seen how hard you work to stay in control. I've seen you choose kindness over anger every single day. She squeezed his hands. The man you're afraid of? He doesn't exist anymore. If he ever really did. Caleb shook his head, but something in his chest was loosening. Some knot he'd carried for a decade starting to unravel. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. How to be close to someone. How to trust that I won't ruin it. Neither do I, but maybe we figure it out together. She smiled, tentative but real. If you want to. I do, more than anything. But Alara, I'm not an easy man. I'm rough, and I'm damaged, and I've got a temper I'm still learning to manage. You deserve better than... She kissed him. It was a soft kiss, tentative, tasting of coffee and rain and something sweet he couldn't name. And for one suspended moment, Caleb forgot every reason why this was a bad idea. Forgot the walls he'd built and the promises he'd made and the fear that lived like a stone in his chest. All he knew was her warmth, her closeness, the way she fit against him like she'd always belonged there. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. I get to decide what I deserve. And I choose this. I choose you. If you'll have me. Caleb pulled her closer, buried his face in her hair, and for the first time in 10 years allowed himself to hope. Stay, he said, the word barely a whisper. Don't go to Fort Jessup. Stay here, with me. Are you sure? No, but I'm willing to try if you are. Alara leaned back just enough to meet his eyes. I'm willing. They sat there by the fire as the storm raged outside, holding each other, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not healing, not yet, but the beginning of it. The first crack in the armor he'd worn for so long. It was terrifying, but it was also the most alive he'd felt since the night 10 years ago, when everything had gone wrong. Maybe Alara was right. Maybe the man he'd been afraid of no longer existed. Or maybe that man had just been waiting for a reason to become someone better. Either way, he was done running, done hiding, done living half a life because he was afraid to reach for a whole one. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world clean and new. They woke tangled together by the fire, stiff and sore, but content. Outside, the sun was just touching the eastern peaks, turning everything gold. Caleb stood and stretched, then held out a hand to help Alara up. She took it, and the simple trust in that gesture made his chest tight. Come on, he said. Let's check on the horses. They walked to the barn together, Ghost trotting ahead, and found both animals calm and rested. The mare even nickered when she saw them, a sound of recognition, of trust beginning to form. Alara leaned against the stall door, watching Caleb run expert hands over the mare's legs, checking for injury. What will you do with her? Finish her training. She'll make someone a good mount once she learns to trust. Like her owner. Caleb looked up, caught the teasing smile on her face, and felt his own mouth curve in response. Yeah, like her owner. They spent the morning repairing the corral, working side by side. It was hard physical labor, dragging away the fallen tree, resetting posts, stringing new wire. But there was satisfaction in it, in building something together, in creating order from chaos. By afternoon, they were both exhausted and filthy. Alara declared she was going to the creek to wash, and Caleb watched her go with a mixture of desire and terror. This was real now. They'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. The question was whether he could handle what came next. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Alara said quietly, I want you to know something. What's that? I'm not naive. I know what people will say when they find out we're together. an unmarried man and woman living alone. They'll have opinions. Let them talk. It could make things difficult for both of us, but especially for you. You've built a life here, a reputation. I don't want to... Alara, he turned to face her. I don't care what people say. I stopped living for other people's approval a long time ago. If you're worried about propriety, I'm not. Or not much, anyway. I just want to make sure you understand what you're choosing. I understand. I'm choosing you. Consequences be damned. She smiled, that bright, fierce smile that made his heart do strange things. Then we'd better make it worth the scandal. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. Inside, Ghost was already asleep by the fire. The horses were settled in the barn. Everything was as it should be. Almost. There's something else we need to talk about, Caleb said. Alara tensed slightly. What? Your work, your father's research. You came out here with a purpose, and getting tangled up with me shouldn't derail that. It won't. I mean it. This winter, you should use it to document everything you can. I'll help however I can. My maps, my knowledge of the territory, and come spring, if you need to travel to present your findings or publish your father's work, we'll figure it out. She looked at him in wonder. You do that? Help me with my work? Why wouldn't I? Because most men... She stopped, shook her head. Most men would expect me to set aside my ambitions, to be content with keeping house and providing comfort. I'm not most men, and you're not most women. Your work matters. Don't let anyone, including me, convince you otherwise. Alara blinked rapidly, and he realized with alarm that she was crying. Did I say something wrong? No? She laughed through the tears. You said exactly the right thing. Thank you for seeing me, for understanding what this means to me. Caleb pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. You're welcome. They stayed like that until the cold drove them inside, where the fire was waiting and the night stretched out warm and full of possibility. For the first time in 10 years, Caleb Rourke didn't dread the morning, because for the first time in 10 years, he had something to wake up for beyond mere survival. He had a reason, a purpose, a partner. He had Alara. And despite all his fears, despite every warning voice in his head telling him this would end in disaster, he allowed himself to believe it might actually work, that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance after all. The illusion of isolation lasted exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks of building a life together in the valley, working side by side during the day, falling asleep tangled together at night. 3 weeks where Caleb almost let himself believe the world beyond the mountains had forgotten he existed, that he and Alara could simply remain here, hidden and safe, indefinitely. Then Marcus Vance arrived. Caleb was in the workshop behind the cabin, building new shelves for Alara's growing collection of specimens, when Ghost's warning growl brought him to the door. A rider was coming up the valley trail, a big man on a bigger horse, moving with the confidence of someone who owned whatever ground he touched. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the quality of the man's clothes, the silver gleam of his saddle fittings. Money, power, the kind of man who was used to getting what he wanted. Caleb's jaw tightened. He stepped out of the workshop just as Alara emerged from the cabin, her face going pale as she recognized the rider. Marcus, she breathed. So this was the guardian. The man who'd taken her in after her father died, who'd arranged her engagement to the respectable Richard, who'd expected her to transform from naturalist daughter to society wife without complaint. Marcus Vance reined in his horse, a magnificent bay stallion, and dismounted with practiced ease. He was perhaps 50, silver threading through his dark hair, his face weathered but still handsome. Everything about him spoke of controlled power, from his bearing to his tailored riding coat to the way his eyes swept the cabin, the corral, Caleb himself with cool assessment. Alara. His voice was deep, cultured. I've been searching for you for 6 weeks. Imagine my relief to finally track you down. How did you find me? Alara's voice was steady, but Caleb could see her hands trembling at her sides. Your wagon driver. He made it back to Redemption eventually, told a rather dramatic story about you vanishing into a storm with some mountain man. Marcus's gaze settled on Caleb. I assume this is him. Caleb moved to stand beside Alara, close enough that their shoulders touched, a statement without words. Rourke, this is my land you're standing on. Marcus Vance. He didn't offer his hand. I've come to take my ward home. I'm not going back, Alara said firmly. Don't be childish. You've had your adventure, made your point. It's time to return to civilization and the life waiting for you. There is no life waiting for me. I broke my engagement. I left. Richard is willing to forgive your momentary lapse in judgment. He understands you were grief-stricken over your father's death, not thinking clearly. He's prepared to... I don't want Richard's forgiveness because I have nothing to be forgiven for. I made a choice, one I'm not taking back. Marcus's expression hardened. Alara, be reasonable. You can't simply throw away your future because of some romantic notion about following in your father's footsteps. Charles would have wanted... Don't! Alara's voice cracked like a whip. Don't you dare tell me what my father would have wanted. He spent his whole life studying the natural world, and he taught me to do the same. This is exactly what he would have wanted for me. Living in sin with some backwoods brute? I think not. Caleb felt heat flash through his chest, but before he could respond, Alara stepped forward, putting herself between him and Marcus. Be very careful what you say next, she said quietly, and there was steel in her voice Caleb had never heard before. Caleb has shown me more respect and kindness in 2 months than anyone in your world showed me in 2 years. Don't insult him. Don't insult my choices. And don't presume to know what's best for me. You're not thinking straight. This man, do you know anything about him? His past? I know everything I need to know. Do you know he killed a man? Beat him to death in a tavern brawl? That he served time for manslaughter? The words hung in the cold air like smoke. Caleb felt his stomach drop, felt the old shame wash over him. He'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when his past collided with his present. But knowing hadn't prepared him for the reality of it. Alara didn't flinch. Yes, I know. He told me himself. Marcus looked genuinely surprised. And you're still here? I'm still here. Then you're a fool. Men like him don't change. Violence is in their nature. It's only a matter of time before that's enough. Caleb's voice was low but carried enough edge to stop Marcus mid-sentence. You've said your piece. Now you can leave. Alara's made her choice clear. I'm not leaving without her. Yes, you are. Because she's a grown woman, not your property. And this is my land. You're not welcome here. For the first time, something dangerous flickered in Marcus's eyes. You think you can keep her? A man like you, no education, no prospects, living like an animal in the wilderness? She'll come to her senses eventually. And when she does, she'll realize what a mistake this was. Maybe, Caleb said evenly, but that's her decision to make, not yours, not mine. Hers. Marcus looked between them, and Caleb saw the moment he changed tactics. The anger smoothed away, replaced by something colder and more calculated. Very well. If you won't be reasoned with, Alara, I can't force you, but understand this. If you choose to stay here, you're choosing to cut yourself off from everything, your inheritance, your place in society, the Vance name and all the protection it offers. You'll be on your own. I already am on my own, Alara said, and I prefer it that way. Marcus's mouth thinned. As you wish. But when winter sets in and you're freezing in this hovel, when you're hungry and tired of playing frontier wife, don't come crawling back expecting me to fix your mistakes. He remounted his horse, gathered the reins. Then, as if in afterthought, he looked down at Caleb. One more thing. You should know that Richard has friends. Influential friends who don't appreciate being publicly humiliated by a broken engagement. If I were you, I'd stay out of town, far out of town. It was a threat, subtle but unmistakable. Caleb met his gaze steadily. Noted. Marcus wheeled his horse and rode back down the valley without another word. They stood watching until he disappeared around the bend. Then Alara sagged against Caleb, all the steel draining out of her in a rush. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. For what? For him finding us. For him bringing up your past like a weapon. For... Stop. Caleb turned her to face him, hands gentle on her shoulders. You didn't do anything wrong, and I don't give a damn what he thinks about my past. But he threatened you, those influential friends. Let them come. I'm not afraid of Richard's friends. You should be. Marcus doesn't make empty threats. Caleb studied her face, saw the genuine fear there, and felt his heart twist. Hey, look at me. I've survived 10 years in country that kills most men within one. I've faced down wolves, bears, men with knives, and worse. I'm not running because some society peacock has connections. This is different. How? Because now you have something to lose. Her voice broke. You have me. And if they hurt you because of me, they won't. And even if they tried, that's not your fault. I made my choices with my eyes open. I knew this wouldn't be easy. Did you? Did you really understand what you were taking on? Caleb pulled her close, rested his chin on top of her head. I understood enough. And nothing Marcus said changes anything for me. Does it change anything for you? No, never. Then we're fine. But they weren't fine. Caleb knew it even as he said the words. Marcus's visit had shattered their illusion of isolation, reminded them both that the world beyond the valley still existed and still had claims on them. Worse, it had planted a seed of doubt he could feel growing in Alara's mind. Not doubt about him, doubt about whether staying with him was fair to him, whether her presence put him in danger he didn't deserve. He could see it in the way she watched him over the next few days, in the careful way she touched him, as if he might break, in the way she sometimes stared into the fire with an expression that looked too much like guilt. A week after Marcus's visit, supplies ran low enough that a trip to town became necessary. Caleb usually made the ride to Redemption every 6 weeks or so. Quick in, quick out, no lingering. But Alara needed things he couldn't provide. Fabric for proper winter clothes, seeds for her specimen collection, paper for her journals. I'll come with you, she said when he mentioned the trip. You don't have to. I want to. Besides, I should introduce myself properly to the town. Make it clear I'm here by choice, not coercion. Alara, I'm coming, Rourke. Don't argue. So they rode to Redemption together, a 2-day journey that would have been peaceful if not for the tension humming beneath everything. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were riding toward trouble, that Marcus's warning hadn't been idle. Redemption was a rough frontier town that had grown up around a silver mine, one main street lined with false-fronted buildings, saloons on every corner, and a population that turned over constantly as prospectors came and went. It wasn't much, but it had what passed for civilization this far into the high country. They arrived in the late afternoon and immediately drew stares. Caleb was used to that. He'd been the town pariah since his trial, the man people crossed the street to avoid. But Alara beside him changed the dynamic. Now the stares came with whispers, with judgment that wasn't just for him but for her too. Ignore them, he said quietly as they tied the horses outside the general store. I am. But he could see the set of her jaw, the way she held her head high against the weight of all those eyes. Inside the store, things got worse. The proprietor, a thin man named Jessup, who'd always been coldly professional with Caleb, looked at Alara with open disapproval. Miss Vance, heard you were in the area. Thought surely the rumors weren't true, but I see they were. Mr. Jessup, Alara's voice was cool and polite. I need supplies. Do you have the items on this list? She handed over the paper. Jessup barely glanced at it. I'm not sure I can help you. I'm sorry? This is a respectable establishment. We serve respectable clientele. I can't be seen conducting business with... He gestured vaguely at them both. Well, you understand. Color flooded Alara's cheeks. You're refusing to serve us? I'm protecting my reputation. Nothing personal, you understand. Just business. Just... Alara's hands clenched on the counter. Mr. Jessup, I'm offering to pay full price for supplies you stock specifically to sell. How is that bad business? Because word gets around. Folks hear I'm supplying your little arrangement up there. They might take their business elsewhere. Can't afford that. Caleb felt the heat building in his chest, the old familiar rage starting to simmer. He recognized this for what it was, Marcus's work. The man had been here spreading poison, turning the town against them, or more specifically, against him, with Alara guilty by association. Then we'll take our business elsewhere, he said, his voice carefully level. Good luck with that. I believe you'll find most establishments in town feel similarly. They tried 3 other stores, got the same response each time, sometimes ruder. By the time they reached the 4th, Caleb could see Alara shaking, not with fear, but with fury. This is insane, she hissed as they stood on the boardwalk. They can't just refuse to serve us. We haven't done anything wrong. They can do whatever they want. No law says they have to sell to anyone. But it's not fair. You live here. You've been part of this community for 10 years. I've been tolerated for 10 years. There's a difference. Rourke, it's fine. We'll get what we need in Fort Jessup. It's farther, but the folks there don't know me, don't care about town politics. No, it's not fine. This is because of Marcus, isn't it? He came through here first, poisoned everyone against you. Probably. Then I'll fix it. I'll talk to people. Explain what? That you're living with a man who killed someone? That we're not married? That won't help, Alara. It'll just make things harder for you. I don't care what will I do. The words came out sharper than he intended. He took a breath, lowered his voice. I care what this costs you, because right now it's costing too much. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe Marcus was right. Maybe you should go back. Not to him, not to Richard, but to a life where you're not shut out of every store, where you're not treated like a pariah because you made the mistake of caring about me. Alara's eyes flashed. Don't you dare use this as an excuse to push me away again. I'm being practical. You're being a coward. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Before Caleb could respond, a voice called out from across the street. Well, Caleb Rourke, heard you'd found yourself a woman. Didn't quite believe it. Caleb turned to see a man he recognized, Tom Fletcher, who'd been a drinking buddy of the man he'd killed. Fletcher had testified at the trial, voice slurred with whiskey, swearing Caleb had started the fight, had been like a rabid animal. The jury hadn't believed him, but Caleb had never forgotten. Fletcher crossed the street, 3 men trailing behind him like wolves following an alpha. All of them had the look of men who'd been drinking since noon. That her? Fletcher jerked his chin at Alara. The society girl playing frontier wife? She know what she's gotten herself into? Walk away, Fletcher. Caleb's voice was flat, dangerous. Just making conversation. No harm in that, is there? Fletcher's grin was ugly. Though I gotta wonder what a refined lady like her sees in a killer. You must be real good at something to make up for the blood on your hands. The implication was clear and vile. Caleb felt his vision start to narrow, felt his fists clench. 1 step. That's all it would take. 1 step and he could wipe that grin off Fletcher's face permanently. But that's what they wanted. What Marcus wanted. An excuse to prove he was still that violent man. Still dangerous. Still someone Alara should fear. He forced his hands to unclench. We're leaving. Don't follow us. Or what? You gonna kill me too? Add another body to your count? Rourke. Alara's hand on his arm, her voice low and urgent. Don't. He's not worth it. She was right. He knew she was right, but the rage was singing in his blood, demanding release, demanding he defend himself and her against these men who had no right to judge either of them. Listen to your woman, Fletcher said. Smart girl. Knows when a man's about to lose control. Though I'm curious, has he lost control with you yet, sweetheart? Shown you what he's really capable of? Don't talk to her. Caleb's voice was barely recognizable, ground out through clenched teeth. Why not? She's pretty enough. Maybe when she gets tired of playing house with a murderer, she'll want a real man, someone who... Caleb moved. Didn't plan it, didn't think about it, just moved. 1 second he was standing still, the next his fist was connecting with Fletcher's jaw with a crack that echoed off the buildings. Fletcher went down hard. His companions stepped forward, hands going to their belts, and suddenly everything was happening too fast. Caleb was ready for them, rage burning away caution, when a voice cut through the chaos. That's enough. A man stepped between them, older, gray-haired, wearing a sheriff's star. Caleb recognized him vaguely from his trial, though the sheriff then had been a different man. Sheriff Wade, Fletcher spat blood, struggling to his feet. You saw that. He assaulted me. Arrest him. I saw you provoke him, Wade said calmly. I also heard what you said to the lady. In my book, that makes you the aggressor. But he hit me, and you're lucky that's all he did. Now get yourself gone before I decide to arrest you for public drunkenness. And Fletcher glared but backed off, his friends helping him stumble away. Wade turned to Caleb, his expression unreadable. Mr. Rourke, been a while since you've been in town. Sheriff, I'd heard you were living quiet up in the high country, keeping to yourself. That true? It is. Good. Like to keep it that way. Wade's gaze shifted to Alara. Miss, you all right? I'm fine. Thank you for intervening. Just doing my job. Though I'd advise you both to finish your business and head home. There's talk in town. Not the friendly kind. We're aware, Caleb said. We tried to buy supplies. Every store turned us away. Wade sighed. Figured as much. Marcus Vance came through about a week back, made it clear anyone helping you two would lose his business. And his business accounts for about a third of the commerce in this town. He paused. For what it's worth, I think it's horseshit. Man's got a right to live his life without interference. But I'm just one man, and I can't force folks to sell to you. Understood. There is one place might help you. Old widow named Sarah Hartwell runs a trading post on the edge of town. Doesn't give a damn about politics or reputation. She might be willing to deal. Thank you, Sheriff. Wade nodded and walked away. Caleb stood there, his knuckles throbbing, his heart still racing, acutely aware of the stares, the whispers. He'd done exactly what he'd promised himself he wouldn't do, lost control, proven every dark thing they believed about him. Come on, Alara said softly, taking his uninjured hand. Let's find Mrs. Hartwell. The trading post was exactly where Wade said it would be. A weathered building at the south end of town, half general store and half pawn shop. Inside, a tiny woman with white hair and sharp eyes looked up from her ledger. Help you? Mrs. Hartwell? Alara stepped forward. Sheriff Wade sent us. He said you might be willing to sell us supplies. That depends. You got money? Yes. Then I'm willing. Don't care what the rest of this town thinks. Half of them are hypocrites and the other half are cowards. She squinted at Caleb. You're Rourke, aren't you? The one who killed Jake Morrison? Yes. Jake Morrison was a mean drunk who beat his wife bloody every Saturday night. Far as I'm concerned, you did the world a favor. Now, what do you need? For the first time that day, Caleb felt something ease in his chest. They gave Mrs. Hartwell their list, and she filled it without comment or judgment, even throwing in extra ammunition and coffee at no charge. For the trouble, she said when they tried to refuse, and because Marcus Vance is a pompous ass who thinks money makes him better than everyone. You need anything else, you come see me. Don't care what anyone says. Thank you, Alara said, her voice thick. You don't know what this means to us. I got a pretty good idea. Now get yourselves home before dark. Trail's dangerous this time of year. They loaded their supplies and rode out of town as the sun touched the western horizon. Neither spoke for the first hour, the silence heavy with everything unspoken. Finally, as they made camp in a grove of aspen, Alara said quietly, You hit him. I know. After everything we said about control, about not giving them what they wanted, you hit him. I know. Why? Caleb was quiet for a long time, banking the fire, avoiding her eyes. Because he disrespected you, implied things that... His jaw clenched. I couldn't let that stand. So you proved him right, proved Marcus right, proved everyone right who says you're violent and dangerous. I didn't... He stopped because she was right. That's exactly what he'd done. I'm sorry. I don't want you to be sorry. I want you to be honest. Are you ever going to be able to control this? Or is this who you are? The question hit harder than Fletcher's words, harder than Marcus's judgment, because it came from the one person whose opinion actually mattered. I don't know, he said finally, the admission costing him everything. I thought I'd figured it out. Thought I'd learned enough control that I could have this, have you, without the violence following me. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe this is who I am, and all I've done is delayed the inevitable. Don't say that. Why not? It's true. You saw what happened today. All it took was one drunk asshole saying the wrong thing, and I lost it. What happens next time? What happens when you're the one who says the wrong thing at the wrong moment? Alara moved around the fire to face him, her expression fierce. I'm not afraid of you. Maybe you should be. I'm not, and I won't be. Yes, you lost your temper today. Yes, you hit someone. But Rourke, he was goading you deliberately, trying to provoke exactly that reaction. And even angry, even pushed to your limit, you hit him once. Once. Then you stopped. That's control. That's luck. No, that's choice. That's 10 years of learning when to stop. Don't discount that. Caleb shook his head, but some of the weight on his chest eased. What if next time I can't stop? What if I hurt you? You won't. You can't know that. Yes, I can. Because I know you. I've seen you furious tonight with Fletcher, that night in the barn when you yelled at me. And you know what? You've never once raised a hand to me, never threatened, never made me feel unsafe. That tells me everything I need to know. Today proved that Marcus has poisoned this town against us, that Fletcher's an ass, that we're not welcome in redemption. It didn't prove anything about you that I didn't already know. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. You're not the monster you think you are, and I'm not leaving. Not because of today, not because of Fletcher or Marcus or anyone else. Do you understand me? Caleb searched her face, looking for doubt, for fear, for any sign that she was fooling herself about what he was capable of. But all he saw was certainty, fierce, absolute certainty. I don't deserve you, he said hoarsely. Good thing it's not about deserving. It's about choosing. And I choose you, now and always. She kissed him then, hard and demanding, and Caleb let himself believe her. Let himself hope that maybe she was right, that maybe he'd changed more than he knew, that maybe love and time and choice were stronger than the violence that had once defined him. They made love under the stars that night, urgent and tender by turns, and afterward Caleb held her close and whispered promises into her hair. Promises that he'd try, that he'd keep working at control, that he'd build a life with her worth defending without fists. And as they lay tangled together with the fire dying to embers, he almost believed those promises were enough. Almost believed that love could heal what violence had broken. Almost believed in second chances. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake Marcus's threat, or Fletcher's sneer, or the knowledge that the world beyond their valley wasn't going to leave them alone. And sooner or later, that world was going to demand a reckoning. The reckoning came with the first snow. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the high peaks in late November with a fury that promised a brutal season ahead. Within 3 days, the valley was buried under 2 feet of powder, and the temperature plummeted to the kind of cold that made your lungs ache with each breath. Caleb had prepared well. The cabin was stocked with provisions. Firewood was stacked high under tarps. The horses had thick winter coats and a snug barn. They were as ready as anyone could be for months of isolation. What he hadn't prepared for was the letter. It arrived with a supply wagon from Fort Jessup, the last one that would make it through before the passes closed completely. The driver, a grizzled man named Cooper who'd known Caleb for years, handed over the sealed envelope with an apologetic expression. Got paid extra to make sure this reached you before winter set in, Cooper said. Don't know what's in it, but the man who sent it seemed to think it was important. Caleb took the letter, recognized the heavy paper and wax seal immediately. Marcus Vance. Thanks, Cooper. You folks need anything else before I head back? Last chance till spring. We're good. Appreciate you making the trip. Cooper nodded and left, and Caleb stood in the falling snow staring at the envelope. Every instinct told him to throw it in the fire unread. Nothing good could come from Marcus Vance's correspondence. But Alara appeared in the doorway, saw what he was holding, and her face went pale. What does he want? Don't know yet. Open it. Caleb broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper. The message was brief and written in an elegant hand. Mr. Rourke, by now you've discovered that redemption is no longer welcoming to you or your arrangement with my ward. I trust this inconvenience has given you time to reconsider the wisdom of your choices. However, should you persist in this folly, I feel obligated to inform you that Richard Whitmore has retained a lawyer and is pursuing legal action regarding breach of contract and defamation of character stemming from Miss Vance's broken engagement. As her legal guardian, I have the authority to compel her return to settle these matters. The alternative is that you face these charges yourself. As the party who harbored her and facilitated her breach, I suggest you consider carefully which outcome you prefer. I will return in spring to hear your decision. Until then, I hope the winter gives you both time for reflection. Regards, Marcus Vance. Caleb read it twice, then handed it to Alara without comment. He watched the color drain from her face as she read, saw her hands begin to tremble. This is insane, she whispered. There's no breach of contract. I broke the engagement before any legal documents were signed. And defamation, I never said a word against Richard publicly. Doesn't matter if it's real. Only matters that he's threatening it. But he can't just... This is extortion. It's leverage. He's giving us all winter to sit here and think about fighting a legal battle we can't afford against people with unlimited resources. By spring, he's betting we'll be ready to cave. Well, he's wrong. I'm not going back. I don't care what... Alara, Caleb's voice was gentle. Look at me. She did, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I won't let you fight this battle for me, he said. If Marcus wants to pursue legal action, let him come after me. I'll face whatever consequences there are. But you should go back, clear your name, make peace with your guardian, live the life you deserve. Stop it. Just stop. She crushed the letter in her fist. This is exactly what he wants. He wants you to push me away, wants me isolated and afraid, wants us both to believe we can't win. But I'm not giving him that satisfaction. This isn't about satisfaction. It's about being smart. He's got power and money and the law on his side. What do we have? Each other, the truth, our own damn stubbornness. She moved close, took his face in her hands. Rourke, listen to me. I chose this. I chose you. Not because it was easy or safe or sensible, but because it was real. Because for the first time in my life, I'm living on my own terms. I'm not giving that up because Marcus wants to play puppet master. He could destroy us. Then we'll be destroyed together, but at least we'll go down fighting. Caleb pulled her close, buried his face in her hair, and tried to ignore the fear gnawing at his gut. She was brave, braver than anyone had a right to be. But bravery didn't stop bullets or legal judgments or men with power from crushing those without it. They burned the letter that night, watching Marcus's elegant handwriting curl and blacken in the flames. But the threat remained, hanging over them like a storm cloud on the horizon. The first month of winter passed in relative peace. The valley was beautiful under its blanket of snow, pristine and silent except for the wind in the pines. Caleb and Alara fell into a rhythm shaped by necessity, feeding animals, hauling water from the creek before it froze over completely, keeping the fire burning, rationing supplies to last till spring. But they also found moments of joy in the isolation. Alara continued her father's work, sketching winter birds that came to the feeders Caleb built, documenting how different species adapted to the cold. Caleb taught her to track in snow, to read animal signs, to understand the language of the wilderness in winter. Evenings they spent by the fire, reading aloud from his mother's books, playing cards, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes they didn't talk at all, just sat in comfortable silence while the wind howled outside and the cabin creaked under the weight of snow. On good days, Caleb could almost forget about Marcus's threat, could almost believe they really were cut off from the world, free to build whatever life they wanted without interference. Then January came, and with it a visitor neither of them expected. Caleb was outside breaking ice on the water trough when Ghost's warning growl made him look up. A figure was approaching through the snow, moving slowly, awkwardly, like someone who'd been traveling hard for days. Caleb's hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against the barn wall. But as the figure got closer, he recognized the gait, the shape, and his blood ran cold. William Morrison, brother of the man Caleb had killed. Rourke! The name was half shout, half gasp. William stumbled the last few yards and collapsed against the fence, breathing hard, his face blue with cold. Caleb didn't move, didn't lower the rifle. What are you doing here? Came to talk. Just talk, I swear. William's teeth were chattering so hard he could barely speak. Been traveling 3 days, got caught in a storm. Please, I'm freezing. Every instinct screamed at Caleb to turn him away, to send him back into the snow. William Morrison had every reason to hate him, every reason to want revenge. This could be a trap, a ploy, 100 different kinds of danger. But the man was clearly dying of exposure, and Caleb had spent 10 years trying to be better than his worst moment. Leaving someone to freeze wasn't who he wanted to be. Inside, he said curtly, slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them. He escorted William into the cabin, rifle still in hand. Alara looked up from her journal, saw their visitor, and her eyes went wide. Rourke, I know. Get him something hot to drink. I'll watch him. William sank into a chair by the fire, his whole body shaking with cold. Alara brought coffee, her movements careful, controlled, and William wrapped his hands around the cup like it was salvation itself. They waited in tense silence while William thawed. Finally, when some color had returned to his face, Caleb spoke. "You've got 5 minutes to explain what you're doing here. Then you're leaving." William looked up, and Caleb was surprised to see not hatred in his eyes, but something that looked like exhaustion. "I came because my wife asked me to. Begged me to, actually. Said she couldn't live with the weight of it anymore." "The weight of what?" "The lie." William took a shaky breath. "Jake, my brother. The night you killed him. The story I told at the trial, about you starting the fight, about you being the aggressor, it wasn't true." The words hung in the air like smoke. Caleb felt his chest tighten, felt Alara's hand find his. "What do you mean it wasn't true?" His voice came out dangerously soft. "I mean I lied, under oath, because I was drunk and angry, and I wanted someone to pay for Jake being dead. But the truth is," William's voice cracked, "the truth is Jake started that fight. He'd been drinking all day, looking for trouble. When you tried to calm him down, he took a swing at you. You defended yourself, and yeah, you went too far, but you didn't start it. You didn't want that fight." Caleb's mind was reeling. 10 years. 10 years of guilt, of believing he'd been the aggressor, of carrying the weight of that night like a millstone around his neck. And it had been based on a lie? "Why are you telling me this now?" His voice was hoarse. "Because my wife, Margaret, she was there that night. Saw the whole thing from across the street. She knew I'd lied. And it's been eating at her for 10 years. Eating at both of us, truth be told. When we heard you'd taken up with someone, that you were trying to build a new life." William shook his head. "Margaret said if I had any decency left, I'd come tell you the truth. Give you back what I took." "Which was what?" "Peace. The ability to see yourself as something other than a monster. I can't give you back those 10 years, Rourke. Can't undo the damage. But I can tell you that Jake's death, it wasn't murder. Wasn't even really manslaughter, though that's what the law called it. It was a fight that went bad, a tragedy, but not something you need to carry as proof that you're fundamentally broken." Alara's grip on Caleb's hand tightened. He looked at her, saw tears streaming down her face, and realized his own vision was blurred. "I don't understand," he managed. "Why would you lie? If you knew the truth, because Jake was my brother, and he was dead, and someone needed to be blamed for it. You were convenient, and I was too angry and too drunk to care about justice." William's face crumpled. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't cover it, doesn't fix it, but I'm sorry. I was wrong. About the fight, about you, about everything." Caleb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He needed air, needed space, needed something to hit that wouldn't shatter under his fists. He headed for the door. "Rourke," Alara started, "I need a minute. Watch him." He stepped outside into the brutal cold, into wind that cut like knives, and let himself fall apart where no one could see. 10 years. 10 years of isolation and penance and learning to live with what he'd done. 10 years of believing he was fundamentally dangerous, fundamentally flawed, fundamentally unworthy of the kind of life other people took for granted. And it had been built on a lie. The rage came first, hot and consuming, directed at William, at the jury who'd believed him, at the 10 years he'd lost. But beneath the rage was something else. Something that felt like grief for the man he might have been if he'd known the truth. For the connections he'd avoided, the life he'd denied himself, the endless punishing isolation that hadn't been necessary. He stood there until the cold forced him back inside, until his fingers were numb and his face felt frozen. When he re-entered the cabin, William was still at the table, Alara still watching him like a hawk watching a snake. "You can't take back 10 years, Caleb said, his voice flat. "Can't give me back the life I could have had." "I know. But you came all this way, in winter, risking your own neck, to tell me the truth." "Why?" "Because it was the right thing to do. 10 years too late, but still the right thing." Caleb studied him. This man who'd hated him, who'd lied about him, who'd helped trap him in a decade of guilt, and saw something he recognized, someone who'd been carrying a weight they could no longer bear. "You can stay the night," he said finally. "Storm's too fierce to send you out in, but come morning, you leave." And William, he waited until the man met his eyes. We're even now. You don't owe me anything. I don't owe you. We both move on with our lives and pretend the other doesn't exist. Agreed? Agreed. That night, William slept by the fire while Caleb and Alara retreated to their corner. They lay together in the darkness, and Alara whispered, Are you all right? I don't know. I should feel relieved, shouldn't I? Vindicated? But mostly I just feel angry? Cheated, like I gave up 10 years for nothing. Not for nothing. You learned control. You learned to be alone. You learned who you are when there's no one watching. She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the firelight. And you learned all of that without needing the crutch of being the victim. You thought you were the aggressor, the dangerous one, and you still chose to be better. That matters, Rourke. That counts for something. Does it? Yes. Because now you know the man you've become isn't a response to guilt. It's a choice. You didn't become better because you owed it to Jake Morrison's memory. You became better because you wanted to, because you chose it, every day for 10 years. Caleb pulled her down, held her close, and let her words sink in. Maybe she was right. Maybe those 10 years hadn't been wasted. Maybe the man he'd become was worth the price. Or maybe he was just trying to make peace with time he could never get back. In the morning, William left with supplies for the journey and a nod of mutual understanding, and Caleb stood watching him disappear into the white landscape, feeling like something had shifted in his chest. Some weight he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there had finally lifted. What now? Alara asked, coming to stand beside him. Now we survive winter, and when spring comes, we deal with Marcus. Together? Together. But fate had other plans. The blizzard hit 2 weeks later, the worst storm Caleb had seen in his decade in the high country. It came without warning, a wall of white that turned the world into nothing but wind and snow and cold, so intense it felt like breathing glass. They were trapped inside for 5 days. The snow piled so high it buried the lower windows, and the temperature dropped so far that ice formed on the inside of the cabin walls. They burned through firewood at an alarming rate just to keep from freezing, huddled together under every blanket they owned. On the third day, the barn roof partially collapsed under the weight of snow. Caleb heard the crack even over the howling wind, knew immediately what it meant. I have to get the horses out. Rourke, you can't. You'll freeze before you make it back. If that roof comes down completely, they'll be crushed. I don't have a choice. Then I'm coming with you. No. Yes. You'll need help moving them, and 2 people can work twice as fast. Don't argue. They bundled up in every layer they owned, tied a rope between them so they wouldn't lose each other in the whiteout, and pushed out into hell. The barn was only 50 feet from the cabin, but it felt like miles. The wind was so fierce it nearly knocked them down. Snow so thick they couldn't see their own feet. Cold so intense that Caleb could feel his lungs burning with each breath. When they finally reached the barn, what he saw made his heart sink. The roof had collapsed on the north side, pinning part of the corral fence. The horses were wild with fear, Flint rearing and screaming, the paint mare kicking at the walls. We moved them to the lean-to on the south side, Caleb shouted over the wind. 1 at a time. You ready? Alara nodded, her face already red with cold. They worked with desperate efficiency. Caleb got a lead on Flint, talked him down from panic while Alara cleared a path through the debris. They got him moved to safety. Then back for the paint mare, who was harder, more frightened, fighting them every step. Caleb was working to calm her when he heard the sound. Another crack, louder this time, and suddenly the rest of the roof was coming down. Get out! He roared at Alara, shoving her toward the door as he dove sideways, pulling the mare with him. Timber and snow crashed down where he'd been standing a heartbeat before. They made it out just as the barn collapsed completely, stumbling into the storm with the terrified mare between them. Getting her to the lean-to was a nightmare. She fought them every step, driven mad by fear, but somehow they managed it. By the time they stumbled back to the cabin, Caleb couldn't feel his hands or feet. His face was so numb he couldn't speak. Alara wasn't much better, shaking so hard she could barely stand. They collapsed by the fire, and for the next hour they didn't talk, just worked on warming up, rubbing each other's limbs to restore circulation, drinking hot coffee, changing out of their frozen clothes. That was close, Alara finally said, her voice shaky. Too close. But we saved them. Both horses. Nearly got ourselves killed doing it. Worth it, though. She looked at him, her eyes serious. That's who you are, Rourke. The man who runs into a collapsing barn to save his animals. The man who ties a rope to himself so he won't lose me in a storm. You're not the monster you spent 10 years believing you were. You're a protector. Always have been. Caleb pulled her close, too exhausted and overwhelmed to argue. Maybe she was right. Maybe William's confession had freed him from his past. Maybe he really was becoming someone new. Or maybe he was just a man who'd gotten lucky one too many times and was due for his luck to run out. The storm finally broke on the 6th day, leaving the world transformed. The valley was buried under 8 feet of snow in places, the landscape unrecognizable. The barn was a total loss, just a pile of broken timber under a drift. But they were alive. The horses were alive. And somehow, against all odds, they still had each other. We'll rebuild in spring, Caleb said, surveying the damage. We'll rebuild everything in spring, Elara corrected. New barn, new corral, new life. We'll show Marcus and everyone else that we're not going anywhere. You sound pretty confident. I am, because I've learned something this winter. What's that? That we're stronger together than anything life throws at us. Storm, social pressure, threats, collapsed barns. We survived all of it. We'll survive Marcus too. Caleb wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that their love and determination were enough to overcome the obstacles ahead. But he couldn't shake the feeling that their hardest test was still coming. That winter had only been the preparation, and spring would bring the real battle. But for now, standing in the snow-bright morning with Elara beside him and the valley spread out in pristine white splendor, he let himself have this moment, this peace, this hope. Because whatever came next, whatever Marcus had planned, whatever fight they had to face, they would face it together. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that had always been enough. The winter sun climbed higher, and somewhere in the distance, Caleb heard the sharp call of a hawk, a sound of survival, of endurance, of creatures tough enough to make it through the brutal season and come out the other side. He squeezed Elara's hand and she squeezed back, and together they walked back to the cabin to face whatever the rest of winter would bring. Spring came late that year, creeping into the valley with reluctant fingers. By mid-March, the snow had finally receded enough for Caleb to start rebuilding the barn, working long days with lumber he'd milled himself from fallen trees. Elara worked beside him, learning to handle tools with the same focus she'd once applied to specimen collection, and together they raised walls and fitted beams until their hands were calloused and their backs ached. But they built more than a barn. They built a partnership, a rhythm, a life that felt earned rather than inherited. On the first truly warm day in April, as they were setting the roof trusses, Caleb heard riders approaching. 3 of them, moving at an easy pace up the valley trail. He straightened, hammer still in hand, and watched them come. Marcus Vance led the group, flanked by 2 men Caleb didn't recognize, well-dressed, well-fed, with the look of city lawyers about them. Marcus's expression was unreadable as he reined in his horse and surveyed the scene. "Impressive," he said, gesturing at the half-built barn. "I wasn't sure you'd survive the winter." "We did." Caleb's voice was flat. "What do you want, Marcus?" "To have the conversation I promised we'd have come spring." Marcus dismounted, his companions following suit. "These are associates of mine, Mr. Brennan and Mr. Cole. They represent Richard Whitmore's interests in the matter of his broken engagement to Miss Vance." Elara climbed down from the roof, wiping sawdust from her hands. "There is no matter. I broke the engagement before any contracts were signed. Richard has no legal claim on me." Brennan, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, smiled thinly. "Not quite accurate, Miss Vance. There were verbal agreements witnessed by multiple parties, gifts exchanged, public announcements made, all of which constitute a binding arrangement under common law. Your departure caused significant embarrassment and financial damage to Mr. Whitmore's reputation. That's absurd. That's the law." Cole spoke this time, heavier, with a voice like gravel. "Mr. Whitmore is prepared to pursue damages. Unless, of course, you're willing to return and honor the original agreement. I'm not. Then Mr. Rourke here will face charges as the party who facilitated your breach. Harboring, enticement, alienation of affection. Take your pick. Combined, they carry significant penalties. Fines. Possible imprisonment." Cole's gaze shifted to Caleb. I understand you have a criminal history. The courts tend to look unfavorably on repeat offenders. Caleb felt the old rage stirring but kept his voice level. And if Alara goes back? Then all charges are dropped. You go back to your quiet life in the mountains. Everyone walks away clean. Except me, Alara said quietly. I walk away trapped in a marriage I don't want to a man I don't love, spending the rest of my life as someone's ornament. Marcus finally spoke, his voice almost gentle. Alara, be reasonable. You had your adventure. You proved your point. But this man, he gestured at Caleb. What kind of life can he give you? He's a horsebreaker with a criminal past living in a valley that's cut off from civilization 6 months a year. You deserve better. I deserve to choose, Alara said firmly, and I choose him. Even if that choice destroys him? The question hung in the air like poison. Caleb saw Alara's face pale, saw the lawyers exchange knowing glances. This was the real play, not threatening Alara, but making her believe her presence endangered him, making her think love meant sacrifice, even if that sacrifice meant losing everything that mattered. Before Alara could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Afternoon, gentlemen. Mind if I join this conversation? Caleb turned to see Sheriff Wade riding up the trail, accompanied by a woman on a sturdy mare. William Morrison's wife, Margaret. He recognized her from when William had visited during the winter. Sheriff? Marcus's tone was carefully neutral. I wasn't aware this was a legal matter requiring law enforcement. Oh, it's not, yet. Wade dismounted, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. But when I heard there were lawyers riding up to Rourke's place making threats, I thought it might be wise to observe. Make sure everything stays civil. We're simply having a conversation. That's so. Because it sounded a lot like extortion from where I was standing. Brennan bristled. That's a serious accusation, Sheriff. And I'm a serious man. Now, Mrs. Morrison here has something she'd like to say. I think you'll find it relevant to your case. Margaret stepped forward, her hands clasped tight, but her voice steady. My name is Margaret Morrison. 10 years ago, I witnessed the fight between Caleb Rourke and Jake Morrison, my brother-in-law. I watched Mr. Rourke try to calm Jake down, watched Jake throw the first punch, watched it escalate into something tragic that neither man wanted. Ancient history? Cole said dismissively. What does that have to do with fight? I'm getting there. At the trial, my husband William lied under oath, said Mr. Rourke was the aggressor. I knew it wasn't true, but I was too afraid to contradict him, too afraid of what people would think, what it would mean for our family. She looked at Caleb, her eyes bright. I've carried that guilt for 10 years. This winter, my husband finally told Mr. Rourke the truth. But truth spoken in private isn't justice, so I'm here to make a formal statement under oath if necessary, correcting the record. How convenient, Marcus said coldly. An 11th hour recantation from a grieving widow. Wife, not widow, and there's nothing convenient about it. I'm prepared to testify that Mr. Rourke's conviction was based on perjured testimony, that he was defending himself, not committing an act of aggression. That changes the narrative considerably, doesn't it? Hard to paint someone as a dangerous criminal when the original conviction was fundamentally flawed. Wade nodded. I've already filed Mrs. Morrison's statement with the territorial court. Judge Henderson is reviewing the case. My guess is he'll vacate the conviction within the month, which means Mr. Rourke's criminal record, the one you boys were so keen to reference, won't exist much longer. Caleb felt something crack open in his chest. Not just the weightlifting that had started when William visited, but the possibility of actual vindication, of the law itself acknowledging he wasn't the monster he'd been made out to be. That still doesn't address the breach of contract, Brennan said, though he sounded less certain now. Doesn't it? Wade smiled. Because I've been doing some digging. Turns out Mr. Whitmore's claim of damages is based on the premise that Miss Vance's departure harmed his reputation. But here's the thing. Miss Vance left before any formal engagement was announced in any newspaper of record, before any contracts were signed, before any legal obligation existed. What you've got is a man who assumed a woman would marry him and got his feelings hurt when she didn't. That's not breach of contract, that's just life. Cole's face darkened. You're overstepping, Sheriff. This is a civil matter. Maybe, but threatening to bring false charges to coerce someone into an unwanted marriage? That's criminal. So here's how this is going to work. You gentlemen are going to get back on your horses and ride back to wherever you came from. You're going to tell Mr. Whitmore that Miss Vance isn't interested and that pursuing this further will result in countercharges for harassment and extortion. And you're going to leave these folks alone. You can't. I can. And I am. Unless you'd like me to arrest you right now for attempted coercion? The lawyers looked at Marcus, who'd gone very still. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marcus's careful control cracked just slightly. You've won this round, he said to Alara. But understand what you're choosing. That inheritance I mentioned. Consider it forfeit. The Vance name, the connections, the security, all gone. You'll be on your own. I already am on my own, Alara said, and I prefer it that way. You say that now. But when the novelty wears off, when you're tired of scraping by in the wilderness with a man who can't give you anything, say, he gives me everything that matters. Freedom, partnership, respect, things I never had in your world. Marcus's expression hardened. Then I wash my hands of you. Don't come crawling back when this falls apart. I won't. He remounted his horse, jerked his head at the lawyers, and rode away without another word. The lawyers followed, Brennan glancing back once with an expression that might have been pity or might have been contempt. When they were gone, Caleb turned to Wade and Margaret. Why did you do that? Help us? Wade shrugged. Because Vance is a bully who uses money and influence to push people around. I don't like bullies. Never have. And because you deserve the truth, Margaret added, what my husband and I did, lying at your trial. It wasn't right. This doesn't erase it, but maybe it balances the scales a little. Alara moved forward and took Margaret's hands. Thank you. You didn't have to put yourself at risk for us, but you did. That takes real courage. Just doing what should have been done 10 years ago. Margaret glanced at Caleb. You built a good life here despite everything. That says more about your character than any testimony ever could. After they left, Caleb and Alara stood in the sudden quiet, the half-built barn framing them against the mountains. Is it really over? Alara asked finally. I think so. Marcus won't come back. Too much pride. And without him pushing, Whitmore's got no case. So we're free. Actually, really free. Caleb pulled her close, rested his forehead against hers. Yeah, we're free. That night they celebrated with a dinner that was more ambition than skill, Alara's attempt at roast chicken that came out half-burnt, Caleb's biscuits that were dense enough to use as ammunition. But they ate it laughing, giddy with relief and possibility. What happens now? Alara asked, pouring coffee. I mean, we survived the winter, survived Marcus, survived everything they threw at us. What's next? We finish the barn, get ready for summer. You continue your research. I train horses. We live. Just live? Just live. Simple. Quiet. Hours. Alara was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, What if I wanted more? Caleb looked up. More? Not different, just more. She took a breath. What if I wanted to marry you? The question landed like a stone in still water. Caleb set down his coffee cup, his hand suddenly unsteady. Alara, I know we said it didn't matter, that we didn't need papers or vows or society's approval, and we don't. But I want it anyway. I want to stand up in front of whoever will listen and say, this is my choice. He's my choice. Forever. You know what people will say. That I trapped you. That you settled. That I don't care what people say. I never have. She moved to kneel in front of him, took his scarred, work-rough hands in hers. I love you. I want to build a life with you. I want to have children with you, grow old with you, face whatever comes next with you. And I want everyone to know it. So, Caleb Rourke, will you marry me? Caleb felt his throat close, felt tears sting his eyes for the second time that day. 10 years ago, he'd believed he would die alone in this valley, that love and connection and family were things other men got to have, that violence had marked him as unworthy of gentleness. But Alara had seen all his darkness and chosen him anyway, had stood beside him through storms and threats and the hardest winter of his life, had looked at the man he'd become and said yes. This one. Him. How could he say no to that? Yes, he managed, his voice rough. Yes, 1,000 times yes. She kissed him then, fierce and joyful, and Caleb held her like she was the only solid thing in a spinning world. They were married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that bore no resemblance to the society wedding Marcus had envisioned. Sheriff Wade officiated, standing in the clearing in front of their newly completed barn. Margaret Morrison and her husband, William, witnessed. Mrs. Hartwell from the trading post came, bringing a cake she'd baked herself. Even Cooper, the supply wagon driver, showed up, along with a handful of others from Fort Jessup who'd heard the story and wanted to pay respects. Alara wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Mrs. Hartwell had gifted her, blue as the high country sky. Caleb wore his best shirt, his hair tied back, his boots polished to a shine that would have made his mother proud. Ghost sat at his feet like the best man he was. They spoke their vows under the spring sun with the mountains rising behind them and the valley spread out like a promise. Wade's words were simple and honest, speaking of partnership and choice, and the courage it took to build something real in a world that often felt hostile to happiness. When it was done, when they'd been pronounced husband and wife, when Caleb had kissed his bride to scattered applause and wolf whistles, he looked out at the small gathering of people who'd come to celebrate with them and felt something he'd thought he'd lost forever. He felt like he belonged somewhere, to someone, in the world, rather than hidden from it. The celebration was modest, food shared, stories told, laughter that rang through the valley like bells. As evening fell and their guests began to depart, each offering congratulations and well wishes, Caleb found himself alone with Wade for a moment. "Thank you," Caleb said, "for everything. The wedding, the help with Marcus, all of it. You earned it, both of you." Wade clapped him on the shoulder. "You know, 10 years ago when you left after the trial, I thought we'd seen the last of you. Figured the guilt would eat you alive or you'd do something stupid and get yourself killed. But you surprised me. You took that darkness and you turned it into discipline. That's not easy. Most men don't have the strength for it." "I had help." Caleb glanced at Alara, who was laughing at something Mrs. Hartwell had said. "Sure. But you did the work first. Made yourself into someone worth loving. That's the part that matters." Wade paused. "The court's going to officially vacate your conviction next month. You'll have a clean record. Might want to think about what that means. You could come back to town. Set up business legitimately. Train horses, guide hunting parties, whatever you want. You don't have to hide anymore." "I wasn't hiding." "Maybe not. But you weren't living either. Not fully. Now you can." After Wade left, Caleb stood watching the sun set behind the western peaks, thinking about what the sheriff had said, about hiding versus living, about the life he'd built in isolation versus the life he could build now, with Alara beside him and the weight of his past finally lifting. Alara joined him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" "The future. What we want to build here." "And?" "I think..." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I think we could do something bigger than just survive. Your research, my knowledge of the territory, we could create something that matters. Document this region properly. Maybe even guide other naturalists who want to study the high country. Create a legacy that's about more than just making it through another winter. A partnership, a real one. Yeah, built on what we both bring, what we both love." Alara squeezed his hand. "I like that. Building something together, something that lasts." "Speaking of things that last," Caleb turned to face her. "I never properly thanked you." "For what?" "For seeing me. The real me. Not the man I was 10 years ago. Not the man people said I was, but the man I actually am. For believing I could be more than my worst moment." "Rourke, you've always been more than that moment. You just needed someone to remind you." "You did more than remind me. You made me want to be better, to try harder, to believe I deserved a second chance." His voice dropped. "You saved me, Alara, in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," she corrected. "I was drowning in expectations and obligations, and a life that wasn't mine. You gave me permission to choose something different, to be brave enough to want what I actually wanted instead of what I was supposed to want. So we're even then. We're partners, now and always." They went inside as full dark fell, and Ghost curled up by the fire while they sat together watching the flames. Through the window, Caleb could see stars emerging one by one, brilliant against the mountain darkness. "Tell me something," Elara said softly. "If you could go back 10 years, knowing everything you know now, would you change what happened that night?" Caleb thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. "I'd change Jake Morrison dying. That shouldn't have happened. But everything else, the trial, the isolation, the 10 years of learning who I am and what I'm capable of." He shook his head. "Without all that, I wouldn't have been here when you needed shelter from that storm. We wouldn't have found each other. So no, I wouldn't change it. Even though it cost me, even though it hurt, even though I spent a decade believing I was broken, it led me here. To you. To this. That's a hard thing to be grateful for. Most worthwhile things are." Summer arrived in full force, transforming the valley into a riot of wildflowers and green. Elara threw herself into her research with renewed purpose, documenting species her father had only theorized about, sketching and cataloging with meticulous care. Caleb built new corrals and took on clients, ranchers who'd heard about his skill with difficult horses and were willing to overlook his past in exchange for results. Word spread slowly but steadily. The man in the high country who could gentle the wildest Mustang, who understood horses better than most people understood themselves. People came from Fort Jessup, from Redemption, even from as far as the territorial capital, bringing problem horses and leaving with grateful animals that responded to voice and touch rather than whip and spur. By August, Caleb had more work than he could handle alone. He was training 3 horses simultaneously, had a waiting list of clients, and was starting to think about hiring help. One afternoon, as he worked with a particularly stubborn paint gelding, a rider appeared at the edge of the property. For a moment, Caleb tensed, old instincts flaring, but then he recognized the horse, the bearing, the face. Richard Whitmore. Caleb tied off the gelding and walked to meet him, every muscle coiled tight. If Whitmore was here for revenge or to make one last play for Elara. "Rourke." Whitmore dismounted, and up close Caleb could see he looked different than he'd imagined. Younger, tired, uncertain in a way that didn't match his expensive clothes and groomed appearance. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I wanted to talk." "About what?" "About apologizing. For everything. The legal threats, the harassment, letting Marcus manipulate me into thinking I had some claim on Elara's life." He shook his head. "I was angry and embarrassed, and I handled it badly. But that's not your fault or hers. It's mine." Caleb studied him, looking for deception, for hidden angles, found only exhaustion and what looked like genuine regret. "Why come all this way to say that?" "Because I owed it to her, to both of you." Whitmore glanced toward the cabin, where Elara had emerged and was standing on the porch watching them. Would she talk to me, just for a minute?" Caleb looked at Elara. She nodded slightly, and he stepped back. "Your funeral, if she's still angry." Whitmore approached the porch, stopped a respectful distance away. "Elara, you look well." "Richard?" Her voice was guarded, but not hostile. "What are you doing here?" "Apologizing. Badly, probably, but I'm trying." He took a breath. "You were right to leave. I see that now. I was offering you a life that would have made you miserable, and I was too blind to realize it, or too selfish to care. You deserve better than what I could give you. You deserve someone who sees you for who you are, not who they want you to be." "Thank you for saying that. I mean it. And I'm sorry for everything that came after. The threats, the lawyers, trying to force you to come back. That wasn't love. That was pride and wounded ego. I should have let you go with grace instead of making everything harder. Marcus pushed you into it. Maybe. But I'm a grown man. I made my own choices. Bad ones." He glanced at Caleb. "Your husband, he's a good man. I can see that. I hope you're happy." "I am. Happier than I ever was in your world." "Good. That's good." Whitmore turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Marcus has been removed as executor of your father's estate. Your inheritance is yours whenever you want to claim it. Papers are at the Territorial Land Office. You earned that money, that legacy. Don't let pride or anger keep you from it. He rode away before Alara could respond, and she stood there staring after him with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. "You all right?" he asked, moving to stand beside her. "I think so. I expected anger, bitterness, not an apology. People surprise you sometimes." "Apparently so." She turned to him. "Did you hear what he said? About my father's inheritance?" "I heard." "That's a lot of money, Rourke. Enough to expand what we're doing here. Build proper facilities, hire help, fund my research for years. We could do a lot of things," Caleb agreed. "But only if you want to. That money's yours. Your choice what happens with it." "Our money. Our choice. We're married now, remember? Partners in everything." By September, they'd used part of the inheritance to build a proper barn with space for 8 horses, a small bunkhouse for seasonal help, and a workshop where Alara could prepare specimens and store her research. They hired 2 hands, young men from Fort Jessup looking for honest work. And suddenly the valley felt less like isolation and more like community. Caleb taught the new hands his methods, watching them learn to gentle horses with patience instead of force. Alara organized her father's research and her own observations into a comprehensive study she planned to submit to the Territorial Natural History Society. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch. They'd expanded to wrap around the cabin, watching the sun set behind the mountains, and talk about their plans for next year. On a crisp October evening, exactly 1 year after the night Caleb had found Alara laughing in the storm, she told him she was pregnant. "Are you sure?" he asked, the words barely making it past the tightness in his throat. "I'm sure. Mrs. Hartwell confirmed it when I rode to the trading post last week. We're going to have a baby, probably late spring." Caleb sat down hard on the porch steps, overwhelmed. A year ago he'd been alone, convinced he would die that way, that family and legacy and continuity were things denied to men like him. And now, "I'm going to be a father," he said, testing the words. "Yes." "How do you feel about that?" "Terrified. Amazed. Grateful." He pulled her down beside him, his hand instinctively going to her still flat stomach. I didn't think I deserved this." "You do. You deserve every bit of happiness you get, and you're going to be an amazing father." "How can you be sure?" "Because I've watched you with the horses, with ghosts, with everything you care about. You're patient and kind, and you never give up on anything worth saving. That's exactly what a child needs." Caleb held her close as the sun disappeared behind the peaks and the stars emerged one by one. Somewhere in the darkness, Ghost howled, and from the barn came the soft nickering of horses settling for the night. The sounds of home, of life, of a future he'd stopped believing in until Alara had walked into his world and changed everything. The winter was easier that year, probably because they knew what to expect. They'd learned from the previous year's struggles, stockpiled better, prepared more thoroughly. And with the new hands helping with daily chores, Caleb had time to focus on getting ready for the baby. Building a cradle from pine he'd chosen and seasoned himself, adding a small room onto the cabin, making everything safe and warm for the child who would arrive with the spring thaw. Alara continued her work as long as she could, documenting winter species, organizing her notes, preparing her manuscript for submission. She worked with fierce focus, as if determined to prove that motherhood wouldn't slow her down or diminish her ambitions. "You know you don't have to prove anything," Caleb told her one evening as she pored over her father's journals. "No one's keeping score." "I'm keeping score. I want this baby to know their mother did something that mattered, that she wasn't just someone who got married and had children and disappeared into domesticity." "Alara, you could never disappear into anything. You're too bright for that, too fierce." He moved behind her, rested his hands on her shoulders. "And this baby, they're going to know their mother is brilliant and brave and completely remarkable, because we'll tell them every day." She leaned back against him. "Their father's not so bad either. Their father's a reformed brawler who trains horses and chops wood. Their father survived a decade alone, learned to transform rage into discipline, and built a life worth living out of nothing but determination and choice. That's heroic in a way most people never manage." The baby came on a rainy morning in late April, arriving with the same fierce determination that had brought Alara into Caleb's life. Mrs. Hartwell attended the birth, along with Margaret Morrison, who'd learned midwifery from her mother. Caleb paced outside for hours, Ghost beside him, until he heard the first thin wail that announced his daughter's arrival. They named her Sarah after Mrs. Hartwell, who'd helped them when everyone else had turned them away. Sarah Elizabeth Rourke, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw and lungs that could probably be heard in the next valley. Caleb held her for the first time with hands that had once killed a man and now cradled something more precious than he'd known existed. He looked down at this tiny creature, this impossible gift, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your father, and I promise you, I promise, I will be better for you than I ever managed to be for myself. I will protect you and teach you and love you with everything I have, and I will make sure you grow up knowing you're valued for who you are, not who anyone else wants you to be." Alara watched from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "She's perfect." "She is. You both are." That summer they worked with Sarah nestled in a basket beside them, in the barn while Caleb trained horses, on the porch while Alara wrote up her research, in the garden they'd planted together. The valley filled with life. Their hands lived in the bunkhouse and helped with the growing business. Visitors came and went, and slowly, impossibly, the place that had once been a refuge from the world became a connection to it. Caleb's reputation grew. People started calling him not just a horsebreaker, but a horse healer, someone who understood the animal's mind and could fix problems others gave up on. He was asked to travel, to teach his methods, to consult on difficult cases across the territory. He turned most of it down, unwilling to leave Alara and Sarah for long, but occasionally he'd take a job that interested him, and always he came home with stories and the deep satisfaction of work well done. Alara's research was published in the Territorial Journal of Natural Sciences, then picked up by a larger publication in the East. Suddenly, she was receiving correspondence from other naturalists, requests for collaboration, invitations to speak at universities. She accepted some, traveled when Sarah was old enough, and always brought back ideas and connections that enriched their isolated life. The world they'd built wasn't perfect. There were still people in Redemption who looked at them sideways, who whispered about the killer and his society wife. There were hard seasons when money was tight and work was scarce. There were arguments and frustrations and the ordinary struggles of building a life together. But they faced it all as partners, the way they'd faced everything from the beginning, with honesty and work and the kind of stubborn determination that refused to accept defeat. On Sarah's first birthday, they threw a celebration that drew people from 3 towns. Sheriff Wade came, bringing a carved wooden horse he'd made himself. Mrs. Hartwell brought cake. Margaret and William Morrison came with their children, who played with Sarah like she was just another kid, rather than the daughter of the man who'd killed their uncle. Even some folks from Redemption showed up. Not many, but enough to suggest that maybe, slowly, opinions were changing. That maybe Caleb was becoming known for what he'd built rather than what he'd done. As the sun set and their guests departed and Sarah fell asleep in Alara's arms, Caleb stood at the edge of their property looking out at the valley. 2 years ago, this place had been his prison. Beautiful but isolating, safe but empty. Now it was filled with life and purpose and love beyond anything he'd imagined possible. "Thank you," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to fate or chance or the universe itself. Alara came to stand beside him, Sarah sleeping against her shoulder. "For what?" "For the storm. For your wagon breaking. For everything that brought you here." "You're thanking a storm?" "I'm thanking whatever force decided I needed you. Because I did. More than I knew." She leaned against him and they stood there in the gathering dark. A family now, complete and whole and exactly where they belonged. The years unfolded one after another, each bringing its own challenges and triumphs. They had a second child, a boy they named Charles after Alara's father. Then a third daughter they called Margaret, after the woman who'd helped clear Caleb's name. The valley filled with the sound of children's laughter, with Ghost patiently letting small hands pull his fur, with horses being trained and foals being born, and life renewing itself season after season. Caleb never forgot the man he'd been, the violence he'd carried, the darkness that had once defined him. But he learned to see it in context, not as his essential nature but as a moment in time, a chapter that had closed. He was proof that people could change, that second chances were real, that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing something better for the future. And when he was old, when his hair had gone silver and his hands were gnarled with arthritis, but still gentle with horses, he would sit on the porch with Alara beside him and their grandchildren playing in the yard, and he would think about that October night so many years ago when a woman had laughed at a storm and changed his entire world. He would think about how close he'd come to riding past her, to leaving her in the rain, to choosing isolation over connection one more time. And he would be grateful beyond words that he hadn't, that he'd made the choice to stop, to help, to open himself to the possibility that life could be more than mere survival. Because in the end, that was what it had all come down to. Choice. Not fate or destiny or anything beyond their control, but the simple, terrifying, beautiful act of choosing. Choosing to trust, choosing to risk, choosing to build something together that neither could have built alone. That was the real story. Not about a violent man learning control or a society woman finding freedom, but about two damaged people choosing each other again and again until those choices became a life neither had dared to imagine. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.